Ira thukagi hiram staltanasar, läger thum rotumer kettlagi eilis, kettla anskin rojaregi. Klive slamter tin milkenegi otl nivra oyser mea. Thukar kinder skein hytli ondemang fyr thukar fardi. Birki birketrun honoms an sitter athir, estra kvindra legi, han askuner fyr burtun klive. Birkti over otl akbaser. Thur vasat extevre athir. Akbasi, hontalja, otl vegomer bosdomer milkerin morkun birketrun honoms. Extevre higun of than hon folkun mine skordum galadum. Than hon skordum use eivingdum. Kvir bos silvun otl barkun öra honoms lendre, alak hon use eichlider. Ögnun birkagi elstre. Arvi edir, hontalre. Folkegums skis smedjadi, otl inni bruker bos kinner thums döder otl blådinger. Ek glistri thu an skelve vegetums, alak ek thu skelve aur förstor. Folkemith an rojar mörker dör. Drängar kvegums lauf silvenreigar. Kintun kvegums lauf barkun eihaver. Otl kvir trur kve döder otl blådinger? Skith ektara kvegums, or ein usse otl sygra kvegums, enger sklemte kardum. Kvir birkemith, naugut forslar, utfäck anfasser kvirtaler. Athir, uft hiri, nem thum birke gjelledre. Fiskersvok fyr thokrar milnin hlidi, min staltanassar fyr birkutrun honoms stid otl bos thrarneganger. Utfäcker otl anfasser skein fea eiskith, birkeskadre. Danner folkethums gore, or eivia, otl kve askretum bitter. Anders birki kvir gordum, Oers smykreginum tanner honoms sanker of spitter. Sankt! Birke gjelledre. Desimir sygra eilis folketums or. Et ein kvindral in kvis dagar finner an rojara hverdum död. Hon bos attere klivegi vägomr. Försvi! Ek danner thu fäg andras finner hover. Tider kvigums or arvi. Ethir tanner honoms pressre. Hundesin hjälte orbuskatlegi rödre. Han eiskal efterdi. Önskra kvigums händedum, Birgemith. Skein ordar dere, ethir feltira in welvi eikomre enders. Folka honoms, dem eskil aur haldrum. Dem kve eithöker desidum haldrum. Naugut thökra sklemti otl engir. Ethir vekje thökragi nesta akbaser konner. Otl hon anhirte honoms, kuninger fortubrede bos folke honoms, hitli einhitterdum. Hon sklemtar an fea aur vetedre. Sklemtar danner thökra eiklir. Sklemtun danner hjälpredum. Ethir övergangi otl nye ordar rönre. Opkinre bos han otl folklun honoms, fyr thökra deller. Hon kvindral nu kyker kver förkundre. Fylka hon bos degums förbunder engir thökra ulmo. Ein use tillhör, bidrer. Einheder. Fremginger. Minns kvindralina arvi mosararoko flygi. Det liker kennedre. Eithöker af ei kvindral.
And hello everyone and welcome to our Conlanging episode. I have a special guest, Toblin, the awesome and amazing individual who created that wonderful video which you just watched, which was part of his Words of World Building challenge-winning article, well, prose piece, you just heard it, from last year's summer camp. So good to see everybody. I see there's lots of you in the chat. Thank you, Elaine, Elaine for the article link. That is where you find it. And I'm not hearing anything out of my speakers. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
Well, I'm not saying anything.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, cool. Yes, last year's January challenge, and I agree, it was amazing. So we have Toblin here, and we're going to talk about conlanging for beginners today. So
Indeed.
I figured we'd start with the whole, in case somebody is stumbling on the stream and they have no idea what the hell we're talking about. What is conlanging?
Wow. Well, to put it very simply, conlanging is just, it's a contraction. Conlang means constructed language. So as opposed to natlang, which is natural language, they're really honestly the same thing. Because if you think about it, a natural language is just a language created by multiple people over a long period of time.
Right.
While a conlang is made usually by a single person over a lot shorter time. And it's usually not as complex. But conlanging in and of itself is just creating languages. And that doesn't mean that you need to create a language that is like a natlang with a ginormous vocabulary. Conlanging has a lot of... It's a sliding scale. You can do very little and still have it be very effective, and you can do a lot with it. It depends what you want.
Right.
That's conlanging.
Right. Now, there's a couple of different reasons why people create conlangs, right? And they may not be entirely what you expect. Like, we think of it, I think, in terms of, you know, this context where we're creating languages for world building or for a fictional setting, and we want to give it a sense of realism. So we concentrate on creating a language for that purpose, right? But it's also used in just kind of like a lot of people have tried to create different universal languages to communicate between diverse language groups, and those are also conlangs.
Yes, Esperanto, for instance.
Yeah, tell them a bit about Esperanto, actually, because people probably don't know.
Honestly, I know very little about Esperanto.
Me too.
And I know that's kind of like, really? You're a conlanger and you don't know anything about it? I know it is a conlang, and it's based largely on Spanish and Romance languages. But that's honestly all I know about it, really. I also know that it's overly complex, and that's really why it hasn't really taken off, because it has too many grammatical features that you not necessarily need, and it makes it hard to learn. So a universal language that is very hard to learn, not that great.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. I'm just, if you're wondering what my face is about, I'm getting a lot of dropped frames. It looks like I've got jerky video going on here, and I'm wondering why, because it was working just fine when I started it. But, you know, Twitch is twitchy.
It wouldn't be a World Anvil related stream if we didn't have technical issues.
See, there you go. This is exactly it. Yes, so... I thought perhaps that, okay, we put some questions to our viewers and we did get some responses. Did you want to start with those, or did you want to start with something like technical terms that people use in the creation of a language? I could go either way.
We can start with some basics, honestly. Basically how a language is constructed. The pieces of a language, if you will,
Okay.
Because that's really basic, and people think it's incredibly complex, but it really isn't. So I guess we can start with that. That's okay.
Yeah, you bet. Okay, let's see. I followed the template. This was my conlang that I created for the same challenge. I understand I was the runner-up, so I'm kind of proud of that. But I'm a total noob to conlanging, or at least I was when I did this article and this language, right? So I am looking forward to learning from Toblin as well. But I thought I'd use it as kind of a template for, you know, some of the terminology, because people are like, I was watching her work on this challenge, and they were phonology, I don't know anything about phonology, so I'm skipping that. And I'm like, okay, explain what things are, probably, because it's not, it's technical terms that people who study languages or people who create them use to describe certain things, but the concepts are actually not that complicated. It's just the words are not known because we don't use them a lot in common conversation. Oh, I heard a dinghy. Let's see, what is the dinghy thing? It hasn't even told me yet because I was scrolling around and now it's slow.
The dinging was a subscription.
Oh, hey, nice.
From Laria.
Oh, thank you very much, Laria, for your subscription. There it is. It's showing up now. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the support. That's awesome. Yeah, Daz has a good question too, so we're going to have to come back and look at that. But yes, okay, so starting with the technical terms here, I don't know, do you have anything you want to start with? Or I just put this article up because I thought, you know, I use the technical terms as headers, so, you know.
Yeah, I mean, you can dive really deep into conlanging, but there are really only a few things you need to know to get started. And a language is made up of sounds.
Right.
A system for how those sounds can interact and combine with each other, and then grammar, how you make words and how those, or it's not really how you make words, it's how sounds go together, is how those words affect each other and what they mean is grammar. And then you have a vocabulary, so that's like 4 things. That's
okay. Yep.
absolute basics of a language, really. And then you can dive in super deep if you want, but that's the
cutting off things in the background because they tell me now we're getting some audio skipping too, and that's not going.
It could be that your CPU is being stressed.
I can't imagine, you know. Okay, yes, I do have lots of tabs open, so we are trying that. Okay. Oh, and we have another question from James. That's really great. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. So, what is phonology exactly?
Phonology is how, or it is what sounds exist in your conlang. So phonology is just deciding what sounds does the language use, and how do those, what variants of those exist. Right. That is phonology.
Okay, and what about morphology?
That's more complex, and it's not something I dive into that much when I do conlang, because the languages I make be overly complex to get the effect that I want. I tend to cheat and use a lot of shortcuts. That's kind of what I do.
Cool.
But morphology is like, how shall I describe it? It's not like phonotactics, like how sounds go together. It's more like how individual pieces of words go together and change, and how that makes your language change.
Right.
It's part of grammar for me, rather than it's something I get to a lot later. If we speak about that, if I look at how I chronologically create a language, morphology is back with grammar. It's later in the creation stage for me.
Right. Okay, it's still buffering for everybody. I'm getting annoyed. Okay, you know what we're gonna do? I am gonna shut down this whole thing. I need that. We're gonna turn Chrome off. Bye. Chrome is going away.
Bye, Chrome.
Bye, Chrome.
Make sure you don't have anything else running in the background, like a virus scan or something weird.
You know, I can't imagine, right? But you never know. I think, honestly, it's my router. I am trying to convince Aaron that the router is failing so that he will talk to the cable company and get it replaced. But he is not listening to me. So I'm like, we didn't have these problems before, right? So
no, but we have them now.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly right. Okay. So you know what? I'm going to look at this over here, and then we're going to come up with the information that way, because I'm just using this for a reference. Because then if it's on the other computer, and what isn't going to interfere with this computer? I can't. Okay, I'm still getting joking on this. I hope it's not buffering too bad for everybody. Okay, yeah, morphology is an interesting subject. So far I've been cheating on that one too, because it can be
I
pretty
definitely
complex.
cheat on that one, mostly because I'm lazy.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yes,
and again,
shutting down Chrome
Conlangs,
helps, so.
I don't aim to create fully fledged functional languages that people are supposed to speak. That's not what I use Conlanging for. You can do that, and a lot of people have done. Klingon, for instance, is a very specific example.
Yes.
It is a fully fledged language you can actually use with a huge vocabulary. That's not what I use Conlangs for. I use Conlangs to create a cultural coherence for names and places, people, and I kind of want people to get the feeling when they read something from my worlds and my role-playing games, or when they hear a name, they sort of get a, I recognize that. He's from there.
Right,
That's
exactly.
what I use conlangs for.
I think conlangs are also a great way to imply history.
Yeah.
Because there's so much in a language that tells you about the history of a place. So you can use them as, like you use food, right, as a subtle world building thing where you're showing, not telling, the history, rather. So I think that can be fun.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't tend to, obviously, so far anyway, I have not developed complete languages, right, because I don't have the time for that. Although that does work for some people. Obviously, famously, Lord of the Rings is all comes from the languages that Tolkien invented. Right? He said that in numerous interviews, that basically he would never, like, the idea comes from the language, not the other way around. So
yeah, he was pretty hardcore on the whole conlanging thing. Father of conlanging, pretty much. I mean, I'm pretty sure there was someone who did it before him, but he popularized it. Words are hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, one of the reasons why Lord of the Rings sticks with us is that his world has such depth, and you get the sense of all these complex, different forces that have been either in motion for thousands of years, or are starting to try to assert themselves in conflict or in balance with the forces that have existed for thousands of years, and the clash of old and new cultures, ancient history coming back to bite you, stuff like that. And a lot of that comes out of the language. But you're right. I agree with you. We don't have to get that complex, right? What we need is a working vocabulary and a loose system of grammar that is consistent within the world. Would you say that that's pretty much the basic bare bones you'd require if you want to get into this?
Yeah. Yeah, probably. I would agree with that. Yes.
Right, so
yes.
the language the grammar doesn't have to be complex either. I totally cheated for my Orcish. I went full out same grammar pattern as English, which is subject, verb, object. Right?
Yeah. And take it from someone who has messed with that. Once you start messing with word order, translations become really obnoxious. The video we watched in the beginning, which is me reading the article that I wrote for the Conlang challenge, it makes me cringe these days, because there are several places where I have messed up the word order because I was thinking in Swedish or English, which has SVO, and that language does not.
Right. What word order did you choose for that, incidentally?
I put the verb last, so if I remember correctly, it was subject, object, verb.
Right.
So I, book, give, basically.
I,
that
book,
order.
give. Right. I was. This is something I did some research on when I did create my language. Was which are the more common ways to do that, right? The word order, right? There's a technical term for it too, but do you think I can remember it off the top of my head? I can't, but
I actually just say word orders. I'm not sure what the technical term is.
okay, that's good. That's good. Okay, so it's not just me here. Sentence structure. That's the term I'm looking for.
Okay, fair.
Okay, so you know what? I looked up sentence structure, right? And I'm gonna do it again over here. Right. There's more common variations of this than others. And one of the things about Klingon was that it used the least common sentence structure deliberately in an attempt to make the language sound more alien to us.
Yeah. As someone who has studied Klingon, Klingon is weird. It is really weird to think in that kind of pattern where you put the object first.
Right. Kayatan just piped up with, yes, Klingon uses object, verb, subject.
Yeah, it is so weird. I love it, but it's weird.
Book taken by me kind of thing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Except maybe there's no by in there. I don't study Klingon, but maybe they don't have those kind of prepositions, right?
Yeah.
Book give I, yes. That makes sense.
That's give me the book. That's book give I. Or book give me.
That's great. Yeah, syntax we're talking about here. Okay, yes, there was a...
when we're on the subject of Klingon, he also chose a phonology, which is really weird.
Okay.
All of those sounds exist in human languages, but they have a really weird distribution, which makes the language incredibly difficult to speak because your tongue goes all over the place as you're trying to speak because there's no what do you call it? There's no structure or unity to the sounds that exists. You have retroflexed sounds, then you have sounds that are all the way up at the tongue, and then you have something way back down in the throat. It's just, it goes all over the place, which
cool, actually.
But it's also fun.
Yes. Yeah, that's let's see. Now what about syntax? What does syntax mean? We run into this term, so you're looking it up. I have to look it up too. So.
Suddenly. No, but syntax is basically it's I think syntax is the actual technical term for what we call sentence structure.
Oh, okay.
It is a little bit more than that. It is how a sentence is structured, but the most basic form of that is the basic word order, which is SVO, VSO, etc.
Right.
So that is syntax. It is which order do words come in. And in some languages, that's incredibly important. In some languages, it's irrelevant, which is interesting.
That is interesting. I find that
I have a language where it is irrelevant which word comes where.
Yeah, that's cool. Which tell me a bit about that actually, and how does that work? Because that might help people to kind of, one might think, oh, okay, that sounds like a good idea because I don't understand syntax, which is cool. Syntax is complicated. Lots of people didn't do too shit hot studying it in school. Let's be honest, right? So maybe I want to skip it, but I'm thinking that probably it would be better to not if you don't understand it, right? Like, how would that work?
I would argue it's better to learn it than do what I did. And it's a bit hyperbole to say that it doesn't have any kind of word order, because it does. There are specific situations where certain words need to come together and be in a specific order, but the overall sentence doesn't matter where everything is. And that's because I have grammatical markers for each word type. So the subject has one marker, the verb has one marker, the direct object has one marker, the indirect object has one marker, which means that you can put them in any order, because the marker points at, okay, this is the person who the thing is being done to via this thing by that guy. So it doesn't matter which order they are in.
That's clever. I might borrow that, actually, because
it is actually something I borrowed. It's not in Old Norse in that specific way, because Old Norse does have a very specific word order, but they also do have markers. So when, for instance, you see Thor or Odin, the names in text, they're usually written with a thorn. So Thor would be TH or thorn, the letter.
Right.
O-R-R, a double R. He doesn't spell with a double R, but because he is the subject of the sentence, it's a double R. So that's the marker that he is the subject of the sentence. Same with Odin, where you have O-Th-I-N-N.
Gotcha.
He normally spells with one N, but he has two N's because he's the subject. Or I don't remember if it's the accusative marker or if it's the subject marker, but it's one of them anyway. And that's where I took the idea from. Unfortunately, that's my least developed conlang, so I don't actually have that much done on it yet, but that's one of the features that I like about it.
Gotcha. Author Goddess is piping up and agreeing with you. She says that is how Finnish works, which makes sense because I understand that Finnish in part derives from Old Norse, right? Icelandic is the closest language to Old Norse. I'm given to understand modern Icelandic.
Like, I'm gonna pipe in and say that Finnish does not at all relate to.
Doesn't it? Oh, okay. Then I totally I must have misheard. Then that's me. That's not
entirely different language stems. We just happen to be neighbors.
Gotcha. But you end up borrowing stuff from each other, right? Like when you're in proximity. That's something that I think is worth mentioning, right? Because you know,
we have so many words in Swedish that are Finnish in origin, which is interesting.
Obviously English has a lot of these too, what we call loan words, right? In Canada, it can be really very interesting, actually, because we are a bilingual country, right? Our English does pick up stuff from French, and we, like, for instance, we spell center, R-E, at the end instead of E-R.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's just being, you know, next to us Anglophones being next to our Francophone neighbors, right? And it's fun because the Quebec French picks up a lot of English phrases too, which is something that the Quebec language commissions don't like, right? Stuff like they'll say le weekend, right? And you know, they're like, that's not French, so we don't like that, so stop it, you know? And that's because, I mean, when you look at it, right, and again, right, the history of your languages, think about this kind of thing when you're developing your languages, right? Quebec is an island of French surrounded by millions of English speakers on all sides, right? So they fight really hard to preserve their language. And in some cases, that actually ends up being somewhat discriminatory towards English speakers within their province, right? Because they're fighting so hard for it. For instance, technically in Canada, you can get services in English or French. You're entitled to it, right, by federal law, right? But try to do that in Quebec if you speak English, right? You might get somebody who studied English, like, you know, in a night class, who speaks some English words, right? And
technically English.
technically, yeah, right? So, but the reverse is also true in a lot of places in Western Canada. If you're French speaking, because we have a primarily Anglophone population out here, good luck trying to get services in French. You will find somebody, but they won't speak very good French. You'll have to work at it usually. So, you know, and this in part explains our politics.
I know how that is, because Swedish is technically a I'm not even going to try and make up a word. We have 5 official languages anyway.
So, yeah, okay. There you go.
Everything is accessible in those 5 languages generally, if you need to. So I know how that is. But I mean, try to go anywhere and get information in anything other than Swedish and English, and you're going to have trouble.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And English isn't even an official language, but pretty much everyone speaks it anyway.
You know, that's a weird one. I would like to, you know, like I have some idea of why that is, but I mean, maybe not in, you know, Sweden in particular, but sort of generally, right? But I'd love to know more about that specifically in Sweden, why that is, because it's just so weird to me, right? Like, why?
That they speak English?
Yeah, why would it? Well, yeah, why would everybody speak English, right? Like, I understand why people would learn English. I get that. I want to learn other languages too, right? You know, but why, you know, why English, right?
It's probably because we have a lot of export and innovation. We host a lot of international things. And in the West, English is kind of the dominant language. Pretty much everyone knows how to speak it, or they at least learn because they want to go international.
Gotcha.
So that's probably why. And we have mandatory English in school. I studied English for 5 years in school, for instance.
Gotcha.
No, not 5. 9 years. Sorry. It's the second language that is, or the third language that is 5 years, which was German in my case. So, I mean, you start studying English in 4th grade, I think, and then you study that all the way through primary school, which is 6 years. And then in the gymnasium, you can study either basic English, which is another 3 years, or you can deep dive and study more English, which basically adds on more advanced classes as you go into the gymnasium. So English is just really prevalent in Sweden. Most everyone can speak it, but most everyone will have a pretty accent. Swedes are not really good at the English kind of sounds. We tend to simplify the th and the sounds to
Sure.
F and D. So this, that, for instance, instead of this and that. But so the Swedish accent isn't great, but the technical knowledge and the ability to speak is really good, even if we sound horrible.
Sound fine to me. I don't know. English speakers cannot roll their R's, right? They cannot trill their R's. And that's an interesting thing because I discovered that is more common. The flat R that we say in English is weird, right?
Yes. The bunched up R that you have, the approximant, it exists in no other language and than American English than English.
Yeah, it's weird. It's a very strange thing. But I have real trouble rolling my R's, right? I'd like to be better at it. Right?
We actually have 2 R's in Swedish because of French influences. Back during the very, very late Middle Ages and onwards, we had a lot of contact with the French nobility. And in fact, our entire noble house or monarchy, we're a monarchy, even though they don't actually have any official power. But the noble family,
Canada,
the king's family, are descendant from the French nobility.
Right.
So basically, when the natural R in Swedish is a r sound, it's a trilled R.
Right.
And that comes from Old Norse, where it was even harder. It was a very, very distinct trilled R. It was Thor. Very
love it.
Like that. But then when you wanted to sound posh and like you know what you were doing, you tried to sound like the French, and they have a uvular R. So r. So we have both in Sweden. The further south you go in Sweden, the more likely it is that someone is going to use the R, which is back here.
That's interesting. And of course, you know, English native speakers, we can't do either very well without a lot of practice. And hello, Hefe. Thank you so much for the raid. Good to see you. Welcome. We are talking conlangs, and we're I think we're talking about the weirdness of different sounds in different languages at the moment. Mostly we're kind of laser focusing on the R because we're nerds and we're nerding about it. So it's kind of fun. I think maybe I better read some comments because there's been a few.
We're gonna get lost otherwise. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
But while you do that, I can also state that this kind of stuff is interesting if you are a conlanger. Because such a thing, for instance, that we in Sweden have 2 R's because of the French nobility's influence on language and culture among us, which means that people try to sound like the French nobility because they wanted to sound high class.
Yeah.
Such a thing can be used for world building. You can use one language to influence another for similar reasons or for other reasons. And trade is a big reason because people meet and the languages rub off.
Way to pretend we had a point with that other than laser focus. Okay, no, actually, no, it does have a point. It's very interesting. Another thing, right, comparable, while we're talking about ours, up until about the 60s or 70s, Canadian French did the uvular rolled R, right? They've kind of stopped. Right, they've gone to more of a flat R. Like I remember in my lifetime, right, when I first started learning French, being taught to roll my R's in school, and then taught not to as much as I got towards graduation, right? And I'm not sure why that evolution took place, but it's an interesting point about French in particular, is that there is a college of the French language, right? And they are considered to be the authority on what proper French sounds like. So if you're not doing it that way, you're doing it wrong. And the French-speaking countries listen to this college and try to adapt, right? On the other hand, English, by contrast, and this is, again, something you can apply to your languages, is there a language college? Maybe, or are you English, which is basically, we'll speak the fucking language any way we damn well want, wherever we are, and steal words from other languages as we see fit, right? So it evolves all the time.
English varies a lot.
Extreme differences. Yeah, it's true. But yeah, it's with the internet, we don't lose touch with other forms of English, right? We are generally understandable to each other regardless of our dialect. But that may not necessarily be true. I went to Maine when I was a young woman, right? I was in a goth band, and we were one of the early people doing recording stuff online. And I went out to where they were to do a bit of a couple gigs with them and do some recording and whatnot. And that was the first time we'd met in person, right? And okay, so I was in a room with a native Mainer, right? And the guitarist was from Connecticut, and his girlfriend was from Kentucky. Right, and then our primary roadie was from Boston, and I could not understand a damn word the guy from Boston said, not one. I was like, I feel so stupid. I don't understand you at all, right? And here I am with my West Coast Canadian accent, right, right, which is interesting because they tell me, but yeah, you say a boot. I'm like, no, we don't say a boot, but actually we do say the U in that diphthong. And we emphasize it a little more. A diphthong is a blend of sounds. When you put two sounds together, make one sound.
That goes from one to the other. So the English I, is a diphthong. I. You go from I. So it slides from one to the other.
Yeah.
That's a diphthong. If it's not a diphthong, it would be I.
Yeah, because they would be pronounced separately,
it just
right?
says A and then I, but now it slides, so it's I. That's a diphthong.
Yeah, exactly. Right, so apparently Canadians pronounce our U's a little bit more in that diphthong than most Americans do. So it's distinct. That's why we say a boot. All right, they're not being smartasses. It really does sound a lot like that to them, right? So that's kind of cool. Okay, comments. Amelie says, Canadian French also does direct translation that we don't do in Metropolitan French. Now, she is from France, living in Scotland, so I totally believe, we'll take her word for it. And yes, I have noticed that too, and it's, obviously this proximity and interwoven culture with all these English speakers around them, right? Daz argues it's not loaned, it's borrowed, and English is the worst. We're practically the thieves' tongue of the world. That is more true than you might think.
Yeah, but it's also not really, I mean, if you look at history, it's not so much the English just stealing from everything, it's the English being invaded and invading everyone.
Yes.
So it's
and then trying to make ourselves understood.
Just becoming an entire mess.
Yeah. I mean, it's a crazy language. I don't blame people for struggling with it if English is not your first language.
And then you have the great vowel shift that just fucked up spelling.
Oh, I know, the vowel shift. We got to talk about that. But first, I'm gonna catch up with the comments, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, the proper way to say weekend in French is fin de semaine, right? And which of course literally means end of week, right? And yeah. Right, but apparently in Metropolitan French, le weekend has started to become part of the slang there too, which is interesting.
That is really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's kind of fascinating.
It's kind of my experience that the French are very protective about that language.
Right. Yeah, and have been for a very long time, and people take it very seriously. There are whole contests on your ability to do like proper French. Right, so, and I'm not sure they don't have the right idea, right? Like,
I mean, Iceland is a very extreme example of that. They do not have loan words at all. They make up new words to describe things that they didn't have words for. For instance, computer, that didn't exist in Icelandic, so they created a word that means computer, but in Icelandic. So I don't know it off the top of my head. I should have memorized it, but they are very protective about their language, which is interesting.
And as a result, their language has not deviated a huge deal. They can open up Old Norse writing and understand it, right? Which is kind of cool.
Mostly, yes. It's kind of like us trying to read like King James Bible or what is it? Shakespearean English. It's weird and sometimes really hard to understand, but there is some understanding there.
Right. Right. Loria says, I always love to see the language tree for Spanish languages. Yeah, it's interesting for sure. You got them all neatly distributed under Latin, except Vasque, which has an arrow lost in the wilderness, as we still don't know who is the father there. That I don't know anything about. So that is really cool. Do tell me more. Okay.
And also, I know we're nerding out about Earth languages here, but if you have Conlang questions, please drop them in the chat as well so we can focus.
Yes, because we're obviously being nerds today, which is fine. As long as it's not boring you guys. We did promise this would be for beginners, and we're talking about some really specific things. I'm not saying they're not helpful, but maybe you're not interested in that right now, right? So, yeah, Author Goddess echoed the same sentiment, but basically it's what Lorraine said. Murica makes everyone speak English. I don't have any... Okay, I have a problem with Google telling me how to spell. That is one thing I have a problem with. I have an issue, right? If you're going to claim to be like the global service for spelling, then you can damn well adapt to my Canadian use and deal with it. Right, I've gotten to a point where I kind of passive aggressively spell things with a U, right? So that's a story
I
I've told
speak
before.
with mostly an American West Coast accent when I speak English. I mean, I'm obviously Swedish, so it's not on point, but it's most like a West Coast American. But I spell British spelling.
Yeah, that confuses people, I bet. Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah, Amelie points out internet and email has made things worse since lots of workers are expected to talk in English with other branches of their companies now. Yes. And don't forget the previous international languages, as Cayetane points out, lost their position, like Latin and French, right? For a while, if you wanted to understand, like in the 1700s, basically, you wanted to be understood anywhere, the best thing you could learn was French, right?
Yeah.
And, of course, Latin was the universal language, and now it is a dead language, so that's interesting. Europeans should use British spelling, says Cayetane, who is Polish, so... That is his opinion, and fair enough. I don't disagree, right? Like I would not presume to tell Europeans what to do with spelling. I am not a European. That's none of my business. But I think it would, as a Canadian, I would like to say that this would be a nice counterbalance to teach Americans that they don't have the right to tell the rest of us how to spell a language they didn't invent. Yeah. Okay.
And apparently I sound West Coast, and some people might think I'm Canadian. Okay, that's interesting.
You do, actually. I would not at all be surprised if you came from Vancouver, right? Like, if I met you in Vancouver, I would assume you'd been there, you'd lived there for several years. I would hear the Swedish accent, but it's not thick, you know?
No, I've heard that most people can't tell where I'm from, but they can hear that I'm not a native.
I don't entirely speak with the West Coast Canadian accent either. And this is interesting, right? I speak with a bit of a French Canadian inflection. And the reason why I do is because my grandmother was French Canadian, and she's the one who taught my mother to speak. My mother is the one who taught me to speak, right? My father was very laconic is a good word to describe him, is laconic. So she is not. So that's where I learned to talk, and I, as a result, picked up a lot of those inflections. So sometimes people ask me, where are you from? Are you from, like, you know, out Quebec? You know, like, I do sound a bit like people who are English speakers who are from that area, so. Thank you for the hydrate, Gala. I would totally do it, but I am currently out of my pop. I will have to go get more in a minute.
I speak with an inflection of gibberish.
Yeah. Author Goddess is the only person in her family that can roll her R's. You should teach me how. We should work on this. I would like to get better at it. Especially because my orcs roll their R's. And in some cases they don't. Right? And there's a difference. Right? That's something I designed in the language. So I would like to actually be able to speak the language I made up.
Yeah. I was thinking that to maybe get back on track a little bit.
Yes.
We can take one of the sent-in questions, maybe?
Let's do that. You know what? I know the perfect one, too, because there is a great question here that is exactly where I think people might want to go first. Where do you even start working on a language? This was sent in by Siobhan the writer.
Wow. That is very individual. I can only really tell you how I do it. I start with a sort of meta document, sort of. It's kind of like when you're starting world building in general. When you want to start with the world, you try to nail down theme and feel and genre and stuff like that. I do the same with languages. I kind of start thinking, what do I want this language to evoke in the listener or reader? What do I want them to think about? What do I want them to feel? For instance, the video we heard in the beginning is obviously inspired by Old Norse. I made a language that sounds Old Norsey, or at least sort of Old Scandinavian. That was kind of my whole idea with it, because I wanted to evoke that Norse feel. And my other language, Gaj, is basically Klingon-esque. It's not like Klingon at all, really. It has similar phonology, and I think when most people hear it, they will think Klingon, which is kind of the point. And Nahut, which is another language I have, is sort of Fox, ancient Egyptian. I want to evoke those old 50s and 60s movies where they tried to speak reconstructed ancient Egyptian, and it sounds nothing like ancient Egyptian, but that is kind of what I'm aiming for. So that's where I start. How do I want it to sound? What do I want to evoke? That's that's where I start. And then I move into, okay, so I want it to sound like that. What are those sounds? What sounds does that language use? And I start listening to those things and try to build my own phonology. What sounds do I want? Does this sound the way I want? No, not really. So skip that. And I just go through. I use the what's it called? The interactive IPA. God, I have to check it out because it's a super useful resource. Interactive IPA chart.
Yes, actually, that was one of the links that I had open. Okay, so if the stream goes blank at the moment, it's because I'm opening my Chrome again. And I'm doing that so that I can share some resources along that line, right? So yes, I use that chart in particular. Actually, that is like one of the ones that I use when I'm trying to come up with what sounds I want to use. Right? And there,
I know, Erin. I know it's pronounced like faux, but I don't like the French propensity to murder letters into one sound. So I say fox because fuck it.
Good for you. Okay, so I have kind of a triumvirate of pronunciation sources that I use, right? For those who don't know, IPA stands for, what is it, International Phonetic Alphabet, or?
Yes.
Right?
And it is probably, and I know a lot of people hate hearing this, but it is probably one of the most important things you can learn if you want to do conlanging seriously.
Yes.
Because it is so goddamn useful.
Yes.
You don't learn like so you can write it on freehand, but start using it. Start describing your sounds in your language with IPA. It'll help you visualize and pronounce things. And it's when you want to share with someone else, because if you write it in English, they're going to pronounce it in English, and that's really wrong. Because English can't spell.
No, they can't. It can't. It's terrible. Okay, so, most of us who grew up in North America are used to our dictionaries using kind of, American phonetic, I guess you'd say. It sounds like this. Now, the reason why this doesn't work is because people pronounce things in very different ways depending on where you are in the world, right? Like, I want to come up with an example that is a word that is just, and it tends to be in the E and A sounds, right? In Canada, that word will be pronounced very differently than it will in the UK and in different places in the UK, right? Than it will in different places in the United States and different places in Canada and different places in New Zealand or Australia, right? So if you say, okay, it's an E sound, right? What, spelled with the letter E, what does that mean? It probably means A to a lot of people in, say, the Midwestern United States, or maybe to people in areas in New Zealand, right? So it's like, it's confusing, right? So this is why you should learn IPA. Here are the triumvirate of resources that I use. First of all, the IPA chart that Tobler, right? That is the big one. That is kind of the source that I tend to use for what sounds like which. As an English speaker,
because the biggest use, the most useful thing about it is that you can click on any symbol and hear it pronounced.
Yes,
it is such a good way to learn and to find sounds, and you really start to learn where the sounds are made in the mouth because they are structured in a very logical way. I love it. It's fantastic.
Yes, absolutely. I agree completely. Right now, as an English speaker, English native speaker, this is the second one I use. This is all the different sounds in English in IPA, right? So you can look at the word that you know, right? Listen to what it sounds like. Find the IPA symbol for it. So if you're thinking, okay, I want a ch sound, right? How is that indicated? You can just find it and use it, right? So that's another thing that I use. And this thing,
sure.
Well, I know, but it includes the diphthongs, right? One of the things makes it easier for someone for whom English is your first language, right? And then this is the third one I use. This is an IPA reader what you do is you take your word once you've made it in IPA, and then you put it into this box, and then say, get it to play it to see if it's like what you think it sounds like. Did I choose the right IPA? Okay, I can shut that down, and I think I may
The
just...
only thing about IPA is that the R sound I usually use the most is written with a symbol that you can't make on the keyboard, so I have to find somewhere and copy paste it every time I write IPA.
Got it. I have a bot. My bot's going away. Sorry. Oh, never mind. Aaron got it ahead of me. Thank you, dear. So, good riddance.
Excuse me, my cat had a nightmare. Hi.
Aw, poor kitty.
So, she needs some comforting.
Yeah.
I love the tapped R sound, and I hate trying to type it because I can't. Exactly.
Yes.
That's the one.
Hi, Cotton. Aw. Precious baby.
Yep. Yeah, she sometimes wakes up and is all distraught and meowing loudly, and she has a she has had a nightmare and she needs comforting. Tapped R. The tapped R is a trilled R that is short. So instead of a r, it's just a r. It's kind of, if you speak Spanish, it's the difference between perro and perro. That's a tapped R.
Right.
Meow.
I'm going to shut down my Chrome again. This is the first time I've actually gotten video going on Discord for a stream, and apparently it and Chrome are not getting along. So I apologize.
It could be that the Discord encoding is really heavy on your CPU, and that's why it's being cranky. But I would have used Google Meet, but apparently it didn't like my browser.
Right.
Just no.
So we're muddling through. It's fine, really. As long as we're being understood and people are following, then I think we're doing fine. Yeah, hello, Sparkle. Good to see you. Right? Yes. Okay, so back to the question about where do you even start? Here's how I started, right? When I initially was creating my Orcish language, right, it was for a role-playing game. There was already an Elvish language. Okay, here's some nerdy stuff for you. This is a file here, right, of every word up to the publication of the War of the Spider Queen in the Forgotten Realms, in Forgotten Realms Elvish, right? Esperar, I compiled it all in a PDF, right? I actually have this online, and my patrons can get it, by the way. But it is also out there for free somewhere. I just don't know. I lost the link. But, and I wanted to have that because all the language stuff out there at the time for Elvish in the Forgotten Realms was basically stealing from Tolkien's Elvish languages, which makes no fucking sense, right? Because the rules are totally different. They have a different sound. They have a different grammar, right? It felt like a total mishmash, and it was just bugging me. So I compiled all of that, and I was using that, right? But then I had a character who was going into an orc culture from an elf culture, right? He's an elf, but he's pretending to be an orc because he's a spy, right? And, magical shape change and whatnot, right? So now I wanted to have the culture shock, right? The language is different. It's Orcish. There's no information about Orcish language in the realms, right? You have a couple of names, a couple of deities, a couple of place names, and that's it, right? So I made one up, right? And I started with...
Probably also based on Tolkien's Black speech.
Oh yeah, people were using the Black speech as their... But I didn't like that either, because for me, I was exploring the idea that who decides who's the bad guy, right? Are the orcs bad guys just because the elves say so? Can they be trusted to have an unbiased opinion? Probably not, right? So I was exploring my orcs as real people, so I wanted to give them their own language that did not deliberately sound as sinister as possible, right? So it ended up sounding almost Klingon in the beginning. It was harsh, right? A lot of very short, or, direct sounds, right? And the first thing I needed was their equivalent of "I, sir," because it was all like ship-faring stuff. So I came up with "Gulkar," right? That is "yes, sir," right? And from there, I had the start of what my language sounded like. So then I started making up individual words as I needed them. Often they were names or the name of a food, right? Or something like that. And after I had a few of those words, I had a sense of what Orcish sounded like, because there was a consistent feel to them. So then from there, you can take those and develop the language. One of the ways you can do it is by using the Vulgarlang app. Now, real conlangers hate this because it's kind of a shoehorn.
I didn't even have to say anything.
Yeah, real conlangers hate it because it doesn't really make a lot of logical sense, and it's very difficult to get it to do what you want it to do if you have specific ideas about things like grammar, for instance. Right?
Yeah. It tends to mess up more for us than help.
Yeah, exactly. But for me, I wanted something simple. So I took the sounds I had already invented, right? And it's a bit of a learning curve to learn how to use this, but if you want to teach yourself how to conlang, you want to know more about it, I do recommend it, because you will have to research every step of the way to figure it out, right? So, what are the sounds you use? And it lets you pick those consonants or vowels or diphthongs, right, in the IPA, right? And then you put them in the list and you say only these, right? And then it'll generate words with only those sounds in them, right?
Yeah, Vogelang is a lot more useful for like random generation that makes sense and is easy to use.
Right.
I use Con Workshop myself, and Con Workshop basically requires you to be a linguist to begin with. It is super complex and not very helpful, but it is more free and it makes more sense when you actually know languages. But Vulgarlang is useful when you're starting out. I will admit that, even if I don't personally like it.
Right. I may not use it for my Elvish, right? Because I have different ideas, because now I'm making my own Elvish, right? Because I don't want to use Forgotten Realms Elvish in my books, right? I'm using my own Orcish. I made it up, so it's mine, so I can do that. But, that's the Forgotten Realms Elvish. So I have an idea of what, again, so I'm starting from square one, right? I have an idea of what I want it to sound like. I have a few words in it. Then it has a more flowing kind of, less harsh sounds, more that are musical and kind of blend into one another. And I'm thinking that I want to go with the markers of the word to indicate whether it's the subject, the verb, or the object, and not have the order be relevant at all, which Vulgarlang isn't going to like, by the way. It does not fucking like that. So, yeah, I may go to, and it was Conlang Workshop. What is it called again?
The link is in the chat right now. It's Con Workshop.
Con Workshop.
And again, it's not easy to use. It took me probably 6 months to just learn how the damn thing worked.
Yeah.
And if anyone needs help, there is a World Anvil group on Con Workshop where there's a couple of us in, where you can hit us up or just poke us on the World Anvil Discord and see if we can help you.
Awesome.
It is super powerful though. Once you learn how to use it, it's fantastic, and it's great for documenting your language.
Sounds great. Oh, and Aaron has a book that he is recommending as a resource.
I'm gonna be right back, and I'll show you something.
Okay, no worries. You know what? Do we want to take a break at this point there, Toblin, do you think? We're like more than an hour in. You can't hear me. That's okay. Yes. Yeah, Klingons are space orcs after all, yes, and Vulcans are space elves, and I have actual space orcs and actual space elves. So, sorry. Yeah, I was just wondering, maybe we should take a break at some point here in the next couple minutes, because we are more than an hour over, but or like an hour in, but there is something you said you wanted to show.
Yeah. I highly recommend this one. It is a fantastic book, and I believe that's the one that was linked in chat. It really goes into how languages work in a very, very basic and easy to understand way. So if you're serious about Conlanging and just want to do it as a hobby, this book is fantastic.
Awesome. Yeah, I started reading through it, so I'm looking forward to getting into it in more detail. Yeah. I think we are going to take a break at this point. Guys, if you asked a question, then do me a favor and if you remember them or close to them, please re-put them in the chat, because we've gotten way out of control. And if you had something that you really thought that we needed to look at, please repost it as well. I'm sorry I am not successfully keeping up with the chat. So, yeah, let's take like a 5-minute break or so, right?
Yep.
And we'll be right back, gang. And thanks for sticking with us. And we are back with the incomparable Toblin, who is helping us with conlanging today. I'm going to mess around with this window here for just a moment, so if you see things moving around in the chat, then, you know, sorry, but if we're not going to be looking at the screen or the Chrome window the whole time, I might as well make you bigger so we can, you know, see you better. And
also, there was loud screaming on the CD10 server that they demanded to see the Mises, so I now have the Mises.
Oh, awesome. Okay. All right. So we'll blow this up for just a minute. This should be... You can probably see this as I'm messing around with it. Yes, you can. Okay, so we'll just make like huge screen here for a minute so we can see. There's the Mises. Oh my god, they're cute. They're amazing.
Yeah, they are adorable.
I hear you're reintroducing them to each other again, and
yeah.
Are they still fighting all the time?
No, actually not. They've been behaving so far. Knock on wood. It's just the 4 of these. The other 2, the main fighter and her sister lives alone in a cage. So I'm reintroducing the ones that didn't fight now. So I'm hoping they can behave. Oh my god, you're all the way down on my back. Come on, come back up.
It's like,
but yeah,
no,
they're a little
that's
shy
tickly.
because they're tired.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, I'm going to leave this window like this for the time being. I also shut down my background because I thought this is, you know, it's really not important that we see a bunch of stars fly by. So it's important we understand the conversation.
Let's see if we can stay focused on the actual conlanging this time.
Yeah, let's try, rather than getting involved in our, you know, nerdy little discussions about languages in general, which... I mean, okay, obviously what that tells you is that once you start getting into it, and remember, I'm a total noob. I'm still using vulgar lang, and the real conlangers are like, yeah, that way, are tisking at me, right? But there's so much that's so interesting about languages that you can really get into and bring into your world, right? It can be a little time consuming. That's the only drawback to that, right?
Yeah.
So, all right, so we'll go back to some of the questions that were sent to us beforehand, I think, because it relates to other questions that people are currently asking, right?
Yeah, Siobhan, I hope that answer helped you. It is a bit dubious how to start, but that's how I do it.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, I started, you know, from there, I made like a dozen, you know, couple dozen words that I, you know, put in as my basic vocabulary. Then I figured out which sounds I was using and why I was using them, put those into vulgar lang, researched what everything meant that they were trying to tell me about, okay, now you need to come up with the syntax. What are they talking about syntax? Okay, right? So figured all that out. Right? Now, some of it I knew beforehand because I was pretty good at English, and grammar I did pretty well, right? But it's been a while, you know, it's been a longer time that I've been out of school than not, so I had to refresh my memory. And I, you know, I worked at it from there, and then I let it generate a language, and the first time it did it, I was like, this is bullshit, and I regenerated the language because I obviously misread the rules, and then I deleted all the words I didn't like and changed the ones that I thought were fine if they had needed some alteration, and then I have a dictionary of about 4,500 words, right, which works. I did read every one of them individually before and change them once I had imported them into the thing. So the challenge, right, took me all month, and like I think 25 days of it were making the language and 5 days of it were writing the story.
That sounds familiar, yeah. I think the vast majority of my time was spent on translating the damn thing.
Absolutely. Okay, so questions. Some of the questions that were asked prior to the show, right? And I think they may relate to things that other people are asking right now. James asks, can conlanging contain a language which has lost its international parts and goes back to being local? To the point where if English did this, a Canadian and an American would not be able to understand each other.
No, I wouldn't say go back, but if two cultures lost contact with each other for whatever reason, they would naturally start evolving in different directions. Because no matter how similar they are going to have differences, and those differences are going to be emphasized by their separation. I wouldn't say go back to being local. You wouldn't lose the words that you had gained from the other language. You wouldn't lose the shifts in pronunciation. You wouldn't lose maybe it affected grammar. You wouldn't lose that, but it would continue to evolve, but in a different way probably than the other would.
Yeah.
Isn't that what happened in Europe and how lots of languages diverged from Latin? Yeah, but they diverged. They didn't go back to what they were before Latin, which is how I read that question.
The only exception that I could see is if you had a group that was oppressively destroying variations in a language aside from what they believed the original was, right? Which happens more than you think in the world, by the way.
The French.
And the English, right? We've done it too, you know? Right? There's another question that Chrysalia had that I want to talk about, a real-life example that will hark back to this, by the way. Right? So, one of those examples. James asked a question which kind of built on that, right? Also in the chat, which is, how do you choose which words to drop in a language? Right? For example, in my world, they are in the future, but they have lost some technologies.
That's not really a lot of choosing in that case. That is just, if that technology isn't used anymore and no one knows about it, then that word for that, or all words related to that technology, is going to be used less and less. And so they're going to kind of die out. I mean, I recently, this is a real life example, but I recently discovered when I was studying some Old Norse, and I was reading through Gleipnir, the section of the Prose Edda, where the Old Norse speak about the chains that they use to bind Fenrir, the wolf, with, which is called Gleipnir. And there's a stanza in there that describes what Gleipnir is made of. And one of the pieces, or one of the things that is made of, is the beard of women, which is skegekononar in Old Norse. And kona is actually a word we had in Swedish up until like 50 years ago. It meant woman, but at the time it kind of meant hot or attractive or desirable woman in Swedish.
Right.
And these days no one even knows it was a Swedish word. So that does happen in real life, but it relates to things that aren't being used anymore. And kona is it really is a legacy word from Old Norse. We have kvinna in Swedish today. So it has shifted pretty big, a lot. But in your case, where you have a technology that has disappeared, I would say, since people don't use it, it would fall out of regular usage and people will probably forget what it is. And it would just be this weird word that no one is taught anymore. So it would just die out. And you'd pick that based on the technology that you lost. So if you have a name in your language for that technology, then that's the word that disappears. But if you need a word that has disappeared, I mean, if you need to describe this disappeared or forgotten technology, that could be any word. But ideally, it should be, you should try and think of a word that isn't quite up to date with the modern language in that case, if it disappeared long ago. And try to sort of, in your head, age the language and make a language or make a word for that. I have an example of that in one of my conlangs as well, in the video that we listened to, but we can go into that later. Otherwise, I will be here talking about this.
Because we'll be nerding out about specifics again, yeah. Yeah. Another thing that can happen is that a word that originally went one thing, right, can change its meaning when that technology no longer becomes relevant. That happens quite a lot, right? I'm trying to think of a real life example, but I'm having difficulty applying it directly to technology. I can think of a couple of real life examples when it comes to like a collision of languages, right? English does this a lot, right? English will have a word, and in its root, apple, right? Apple comes from, like, I think our Anglo-Saxon origins, right? And then the Normans came over, right? And French started changing the local language, and because that was the language of the upper class, so people wanted to learn to speak it, right? Sound more posh. And so then we got the word fruit, right? So the original word apple meant fruit. It was any fruit, right? But nowadays we use apple for a particular type of fruit. It became specialized, right? English has lots of examples of things like that. So that might be something, a way to approach it, James, right? Maybe the word computer is no longer entirely relevant, but computer now means a calculator, right? Yeah. Yeah, Amelie has a good example here, right? She says we don't have the same kind of phone now, but we still say things like hang up, even if we don't do it physically.
Exactly.
Our kids probably don't even understand why the hell we call it hang up, right? Some of us remember taking a rotary phone and putting it on the cradle, right? The ear bit. But, obviously I haven't done that in years. I push a button. Right?
Yep. And barely even that anymore. We just touch a screen now.
Velcro, says Aaron, that's a slightly different thing, though, actually, right? Because Velcro was originally wasn't it the brand name of the company that came up with the first adhesive strip, right? And now it's become the word we use for it, like Band-Aid, right? Band-Aid was a brand name, and now it's the word, right?
Yeah, that has happened a lot in American English, I've noticed. I've tried my best to find equivalents of that in Swedish, and I not really succeeded. We don't have many brand names here that take over in that way.
Right. And actually, that's an interesting point. So here's a case point about how language and world building. What does this tell you about Americans, right? It tells you that corporations are ubiquitous, and they probably have way too much goddamn power, right? Because they change our language.
Yeah.
That's huge. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. US is hardcore about branding. Okay. So, and hello, Twinkle. I saw you come in. It's good to see you. Let's see here. I don't want to get... Oh, interesting. Okay, so now we have some phonology questions here that may require some more detailed reading. I'm going to try, because there's a conversation going on here that is all related. Okay. All right, so this is responding to Barbarossa, right? His question, right? If my race is humanoid, human in appearance, but have wings and bird legs, they're harpies, right? I know his race is harpies that he's talking about, right? With sharp teeth and can fly, right? How do you picture their language sounding? I'm mixed with tough, rough, or smooth, almost musical, right?
That is...
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that's entirely irrelevant, really, what they look like. What's important is, what do their vocal tract look like? Do they have mouths? Do they look like us? If they look like us, they're going to sound like us. If they have beaks, then you're going to have vastly different sounds coming out of them. And language doesn't necessarily adhere to what you look like. I mean, of course, it limits what kind of sounds you can make, because your vocal tract and your mouth looks different. So, I mean, a dog and we humans can't make the same sounds, because we have vastly different vocal tracts and mouths and lips, for that matter. So as long as they look like us, they're going to sound like us. But what I'm guessing is you're looking for what kind of sounds do they have, and that is entirely up to you, because that isn't dependent on what you are or where you are. That is just... we still don't know. We know a few things that cultures that live at high altitudes tend to use certain vowels that use less air because the air is thinner, so you're using less air when you're speaking. But that's a very, very subtle thing that doesn't really show very clearly. But we've seen slight such tendencies in Earth languages, that if you have like a people who live very far up on a mountain top where the air is thinner, they will use certain vowels that use less air and not as strong consonants, etc. You even have languages that are whistles entirely. So it's not really dependent on who you are. More how you look and where you live is more influential than what you look like in you know, the rest of you.
If you are going to change that apparatus, then, you know, yeah, I agree. That's where you have to think about, will it change the apparatus, right? Dogs don't have lips. If dogs were trying to speak English, even if they were intelligent, it would come out like, "Oh, Reggie," you know, because they can't, you know, they probably can't do P sounds. It would sound a lot like that. It would, because they wouldn't be able to make some of the noises that we can. On the other hand, they make noises that we can't, right? Do your harpies have bird screech sounds? Well, there's no IPA for that, right?
Exactly. Because the IPA is designed to mimic human sounds. And there are spots in the IPA charts for sounds that could exist technically, but that humans can't make.
Right.
Because we're not built that way.
Yeah, exactly. I made some acknowledgement of this. Of course, my orcs have tusks, right? Big teeth, like this. So they have difficulty with the P's and the B's and related stuff, right? And difficulties with F's and V's and differentiating them. So they often don't. They just kind of blend them all together. They still have the noises. They still make them. They just, you know, don't see much difference between them sometimes. You know, like some languages, like you say, right, the TH sound and the D sound often get blended because that sound doesn't really exist in Swedish, right? So,
indeed. And we use a lot of D instead. So it's easy to just shift that th sound into D, or the sound into D. And I mean, it happens in English too. You have Cockney English, for instance. They do it too. You have f and v and d instead of those sounds. So it's just simplification, really.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And by the way, thank you, Darth, for being moderator and putting some things, that the questions that you saw in the Discord for me. I appreciate that. And, so yes, how do you, from Author Goddess, how do you approach colloquials and slang? And Chris, I will get to your question if you're still in the chat, but I think it requires a detailed answer, so I kind of wanted to leave it for a little bit. Right, so yeah. So from Author Goddess, how do you approach colloquials and slang?
Wow, that's a hard one. And I will freely admit that I've actually never really... I've never finished a language far enough where that becomes relevant. But I would probably approach it in similar way as to how we humans do it. And I mean, we humans are very random about our slang. We have all kinds of weird words that become just colloquial. For instance, one that we discussed today on Twitter was stan, which apparently has multiple meanings. I didn't know that. Where one considers to be a stan for something is a positive thing because you're like a hardcore fan, while the other meaning is to be a stan for something is to be a fanatical, rigid, toxic fan for something. So you have two different meanings of the word, and stan is just a name, and it comes from an Eminem song because a person in that Eminem song was named Stan and he was a toxic fan. That's one way how a slang word is invented. So I would say approaching slang is difficult because it's so random. We humans are random. Anything can become slang. In one of my worlds, for instance, I have droids or robots, basically security droids that have sirens, and the nickname for those in slang is wee woo because they sound like that.
That's
the
cool.
Siren, wee woo, wee woo. So that's a security droid. That's one way to make slang. There isn't really any rules for it. You just have to come up with something that you think would be easy to say, because usually slang is shorter and more to the point than the original word is, but not always, because we do I mentioned Cockney earlier, and you have rhyming slang, and that's just weird. But
for those not familiar, Cockney
it's
and rhyming slang, they have a phrase that they came up with that rhymed with the word they were actually using. And then they drop all the stuff that explains what the hell that last rhyming word was supposed to mean and just use that. Right?
Yeah. So it basically means that you need to know all of these rhyming slang sentences to understand what they mean. Otherwise, it's just, what?
Yeah, exactly. I throw a little bit of that in. I have a Cockney character in my Weird West stories, and I throw that in every now and then. My Canadians are like, what? Yeah.
What?
What the hell was that?
They make no sense if you don't understand rhyming slang.
Yeah, which was the goal, right? So that because they tended to run afoul of the law because they were poor, so they developed their own language so that the posh types would not understand what the hell they were doing, which makes sense. Yeah, I'm going apples to give the trouble a cup of rosy, says Aaron. That is Cockney rhyming slang right there.
That is Cockney rhyming slang, yeah.
And I actually know what the cup of rosy and the trouble are. I don't know what the apples are. So that's interesting.
No, I'm not very good with. I know about rhyming slang, but I don't know any rhyming slang, so it's still just gibberish to me.
The trouble is a wife.
It as gibberish.
The trouble is your wife, because it comes from trouble and strife. Yeah. Right? This goes to show you what they thought of marriage. A cup of rosy is, something like Rosie Lee. They mean tea, right? Apples and pears upstairs, right? So I'm going apples. So that's even more complicated, right? Because I'm going apples. I'm going upstairs, right? I'm going insane, right? Yeah.
Yeah. It's just all
like, because it has that meaning too.
This is fun to come up with for your conlang, but you have to kind of sit down and think about, am I just getting world builder's disease right now?
Yes.
Am I doing too much here?
Yeah.
Could I just write an article explaining that they do this instead of actually doing it? So you have to, conlanging has the tendency, I mean, world builder's disease is something we all get now and then, where we do too much. But conlanging absolutely has the potential to go way too far, which is why I limit myself. I stick to phonology, morphology, and basic grammar, so I can make sentences and names that sound like they belong in a region of the world, but I don't go further. Because if I go further, I'll get stuck for months and not get anything done.
Yep, legit. Author Goddess clarifies too, she might also mean like how we name things based on how we see them, right? Slang of things, right? Yeah. Yeah, okay, I actually cheated with this one, right? I can answer this question how I did it, right? Okay, so my orcs they come from a spacefaring culture. Their technology is all Age of Sail and magic, right? So a lot of the stuff that has made it into English slang from seafaring also made it into Orcish, right? Like they have a word for the scuttlebutt, right? And it means the same things that it means in English, right? In English, the scuttlebutt is what's the gossip, what's the news, what's going on, right? And it comes from the fact that the place where the water was kept on the deck of the ship was called the scuttlebutt, and you gathered around there like the water cooler at the office to share and chatted, right? And shared information, right? So they have that same kind of stuff. So I had a ready-made vocabulary there because there's so many seafaring terms that have become common figures of speech in English. Right, and then on top of that, I had a cultural hero who wrote a lot of stuff that people quote as proverbs, right, and guides to life. And so whenever I made up one of those phrases, right, I had ready-made slang right there, because they might just refer to part of the phrase, right? Instead of the whole quote, they'll use part of the quote because everybody in the culture understands what that means in the same way that, you know, Cockney rhyming slang works. And there's a ready-made, you know, slang right there, right? So cheating, basically, is what I did.
Yeah, the more you can cheat, the better, to be honest. Because most of you out there are probably going to be world building or going to be conlangers because world building. It's a tool in your toolkit for world building. You're not conlanging for the sake of conlanging. If you are, congratulations, and also my condolences, because now your life has been taken over by languages. But
yeah,
as a world builder, you have to limit yourself, because if we're going to define if you're going to write about a village, you don't need to start with the galaxy and the solar system, right? You kind of need to focus what you're working with, and you can easily overwork yourself with conlanging. That is, I would say, it's the worst part of world building. If you're getting the conlanging, that it can absolutely balloon out of control. So be clear when you start conlanging what you're going to use it for and what purpose it's going to have,
and stick to that.
Otherwise, you're going to get lost.
Yeah,
very easily.
Yeah. I find that if you have their yes and no, right, a couple of phrases that are used in different ways from the language you're writing in initially, right, and a couple of words for food and family relationships, that can give the feel that there's a whole language right there, right? Because
yeah, it can get you very far.
Yeah. And, you know, those are the basics, right? That's what I started with because that's what I needed. And then I built the rest of the language around that.
Yeah. I mean, the video that you played in the beginning here, my Conlang article, basically, it sounds like it's a well-developed, fully fledged language.
Yeah, it really does.
It's not. It's like, I think the dictionary is like 200-300 words, and there's some basic grammar in there, but it doesn't cover everything.
Right.
So it still gets the point across. It sounds genuine, and that's the point.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Okay, so I am going to address, I mean, this question could get quite long, which is why I saved it, right? And this was from Chrysalia, right? And that is, assuming fantasy languages have been created for a world, when conlanging for, say, a pidgin or a Creole, how would you approach their creation?
Yeah, that was difficult because my personal knowledge with pidgin language is pretty limited. And first off, for the people who don't know what Creole or pidgin language
yes, thank you.
That Creole, it's basically two languages mixing together in order to make sense to both parties. It happened a lot with African slaves, for instance, and the colonies. The whole colonization era is full of Creoles and pidgin languages. And the difference between a Creole and a pidgin language is that Creole is basically, it's a blending of two languages, but you kind of need to know either or in order to understand it, while pidgin is a fully fledged language that has become out of two other languages, right, or at least two other languages.
I looked it up for a definition, right? And what I read was that a pidgin is basically, it's like a trade language. It's been put together. It's sort of a created language in and of itself, and that it isn't a fully developed language, but you can make yourself understood across, and it does blend different aspects. And a Creole is something that has evolved from a couple or more than a couple different languages to become its own language. Right, like it's its own thing.
The other way around. I had it backwards. Yeah.
But it's interesting.
It's really interesting. There's a movie with Leonardo DiCaprio that's called Blood Diamond, where he's a diamond trader.
Right, I've seen it.
They speak occasionally West African Creole in that, and it's super interesting because you can hear both English and the African influences in it. It's really cool.
A really interesting example that I found was the French Creole of Louisiana, right? Mm-hmm. This is really, okay, as an English speaker who has learned a little French, I love it, because I find it easier to understand than French proper, because the words are all French, right? The vocabulary is all French, and the grammar is all English. Right? So it's like I can come up with a direct translation. I mean, not entirely. There are some places where like a whole phrase has been, used as a unit, right? So it doesn't precisely follow the English grammar, but it's close enough that I really have no trouble following it, right? And I have to think about the grammar when I'm listening to French and go, oh, okay, right, yeah, they reverse the order of that. So, okay, wait, and, but my brain doesn't stutter over that at all, right? And why the Creole of Louisiana developed, right? Now, this is a good example of how languages can be used for your history. Of course, the French got here to Canada as far as the big colonial powers, right? Before anybody else, the Norse were way ahead of them, but that's not, okay, right? And the French got here, they were here for a long time. Then the English moved into Atlantic Canada and said, get the fuck out of here, Frenchie, basically, right? They did, and they kicked him out, right? And that was the Acadian people, and they moved, there are still Canadians, or Acadians, pardon, there are still Acadians in parts of Atlantic Canada today, right? There's a whole area called the Acadian Coast, which is beautiful and lots of fun, but a lot of these people moved down, and eventually they made it to Louisiana, where they were just fine until the Louisiana Purchase happened, right? And at that time, there was a whole mixture of like African slaves and the First Nations people of the area and all this kind of stuff going on. And then the Louisiana Purchase happened, and then all of a sudden they're part of the United States. And then the United States told them to stop speaking French, right? After a certain point, right? So, yeah, right? Which, by the way, is genocide, according to the
definition.
UN definition, which it should be, because trying to destroy a language also destroys a culture.
Yeah.
Right. So, and Canada is guilty of this in spades. So I'm not, I'm not defending us, and I'm not picking on Americans. I'm saying this is bad, and the reason why it's bad is because it destroys culture. Right. So that Creole language there has such depth of history. Right. If you trace how it developed, you learn there were big colonial powers in North America, and they've at one time one was dominant. One was dominant, and then another one became dominant, and then they kicked the other people out, and then the other people kicked them out, and the influence of other cultures around, and I mean there's so much in that, right? And you can take all of that, and that's like. I joke that food can tell you a great deal, right? George R. R. Martin always makes feasts when he doesn't know what else to do, right?
Yeah.
But it's useful because it tells you things about how the cultures all work together. Languages can be like that, right? So, yeah, sorry. So that's why I knew I was going to go off with that, because it is so useful. So then back to the original question, how would you create a pidgin or a Creole? I would cheat. Myself?
Yeah, I would say that too. I would cheat too, because that is such an organic thing. It is basically two languages coming together out of necessity, and that just kind of happens. And if you really want to do that as a conlanger, you're either going to have two fully fledged languages and try to sit down and puzzle them together and see what would influence the other, or cheat, because it is super, super complex.
Yeah.
And I would definitely cheat personally. I would not put the time in to do that, because it's such a natural thing, and trying to simulate natural things is hard.
Yeah, because chaos systems are complex.
Mm-hmm.
Right. How I would cheat is I would basically use the example of French Creole. I would use the grammar of one and the vocabulary of the other, and pretty much default to that, except where the concept didn't cross over, which happens more often than you might think. Right? For instance, the English word courage does not in any way contain all the meanings that the original French word courage does. It doesn't, right? It's a totally different concept, which is interesting. So, yeah. Yeah, that's how I would handle it. If you want examples, there is a wonderful language of in the South Pacific called Tok Pisin, or Pisan, right? And this is the language that, like, okay, this is what they sort of tried badly to imitate-ish with Jar Jar Binks and the Gungans there, right? That's sort of what it sounds like. And it's a fully developed Creole language. Like, it's a whole thing. That is the proper grammar. That is the way it is spoken. There is a wonderful video of, I think, Prince Charles addressing people of Papua New Guinea in Tok Pisin. And it's really very interesting to listen to, you know.
Interesting, yeah.
That's cool. It's very cool. And also, you know, French Creole. Listen to these if you are familiar with either one of the languages that are involved in their creation, right? And then this will tell you, this will show you ways in which these languages evolve. And it's really I love it. I think it's fascinating.
Cadison has a point there.
He does. World builders always cheat. He says it's impossible to artificially create whole cultural histories in the way it develops in real life. Yeah, that's true. You can't. All you can do is give the illusion.
Yeah. And the interesting part, that's a very short side note, but the way I realized this as a world builder, and I stopped trying to do everything, right? I tried to focus. Is actually I played with Guy from How to Be a Great GM, and he had me play a chaos god or a chaos deity whose job it was to break up the rules of the universe in order to make them possible to change and contradict, so that the world could become more diverse. And I said a line I just winged it, basically. And I said a line where I'm just one person. I can only create so many rules and so many systems. You are billions of people. You can come up with so much more than I can. And that is the key, that I can never create a world as living and as deep as our world, because there's more people in it. I'm just one guy. So I have to cheat. I have to hint at the depth and put my focus where it counts and what you need to know. And as a TTRPG creator, I have to also consider the fact that my game and my settings are going to be in the hands of someone else. The more I write, the more details I make, the more they have to learn, and the more they are limited, because they have to stick to what I wrote. So if I just give them the frameworks and this is it, here's where you are, but here's the important part, the rest is up to you, then they have more freedom and they need to learn less. They just have a framework they can work out of. And that's something I found is very important as a world builder, in order to stop world building for sake of world building. Unless that's what you're doing, in which case it's fine. But most of us are probably trying to get a book written or a game released or a campaign going. And then you need to know where to limit yourself. Conlanging is probably the first thing you shouldn't do if you're trying to limit yourself.
100%. It can get way out of hand real fast. But it doesn't have to, right? It doesn't have to, as long as you stick with the basics of what you immediately need. Yeah.
Exactly.
Author Goddess has a good point there, which relates, and I mean, it's a broader question, but it relates, right? And it's interesting to think of in the context of world building with languages. Wait, if merging cultures creates new and modified languages, and the taking/suppression of language is genocide, does that make globalization a form of consensual or organic genocide? Sort of, right?
Sort of, yeah. But it's kind of the intent behind it.
Exactly, right? Like, I just edited Author Goddess's next book, right? And she deals with some of these issues in her book, right? Where there are people who, you know, and some of them are resisting westernization, right? And some of them are actively participating because it means improvement for their personal life, right? And the lives of their children. And it's, you know, both are rational points of view, right? And are perfectly valid, right? And that's why the people who are affected have to make up their own minds for themselves which way they want to go, and and is there a way to do both, right? We're trying to figure that out in Canada, right? Truth and reconciliation is one of the big things facing us right now, dealing with resolving things effectively for our Indigenous peoples. I don't know if we're coming up with the right answers. We certainly haven't in the past, but we're making an effort now, right? We're doing things like, okay, yes, we'll teach your languages in schools, and there will be, resources available for that. And, each nation is a nation within a nation in Canada, which is kind of an interesting concept, right?
Yeah.
Certain things, it's like with provinces, right? Some things are their jurisdiction and some things are the federal jurisdiction. This is one of the problems that keeps affecting the water supply issue, which often gets international news, and it should, right? It is not right that a lot of our Indigenous people are living on, and a lot of it is that the land that they got in whatever treaty they had to make with us, right? The, settler peoples, right? It's often they ended up in really shitty marginalized land, right? So getting resources to it can be really difficult. But whose jurisdiction is it, right? Because a lot of those jurisdictions actually fall within the nation in question. So does Canada as a federal power have the right to interfere in how they do it, right? And if they do, what is the form that's going to take? Does it force them to become dependent upon the federal resources when a lot of them don't want to do that, right? It's complicated. It's complicated, right? We need to do better, right?
Yeah.
But we're working on it.
A lot of human interaction boils down to that, to be honest. It's complicated because there are no easy answers often, unfortunately. Especially not when we kind of started with something bad and now we have to kind of make up for it. Colonization, for instance.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's a good point too. Right? Authorata says, I also talk a lot about the victim culture having autonomy, like victim quote, right? The culture that is being oppressed or absorbed, right? Having autonomy to determine where they give in to the absorbing culture. Yeah, and I agree completely that that should be entirely their decision, right? If you want to, go along to get along in some areas, you should have the right to do that, and people shouldn't be. And you know what? White savior complex, right? We do this a lot, right? We jump in like that whole thing about that one actress in Britain who wore dreadlocks and a bunch, because it was a Caribbean holiday, and a bunch of American people were like, white liberals and, American black people were all like, you shouldn't do that, it's cultural appropriation, and all the Caribbeans were like, we think it's fine, right?
Yeah, let the complex. Right people be offended.
Right, let the right people be offended
on behalf of someone else.
That's right. It's their right. It's their decision to make. It's not yours, right? Don't jump in before they do. Support them in whatever stance they take.
But now we've gotten really sidetracked.
Yes, we have. But yeah. Okay, we will get back to conlanging. I think I've just about exhausted the questions that we had.
Yeah. Those are the questions that was sent in, and some of them are really difficult. But are there more questions from chat?
That is a good question. Are there more questions? Let's go back. Let's see.
For instance, we kind of started on the whole conlanging from scratch as a beginner, but we really didn't finish. So are there any parts of conlanging that you feel we need to explain better? Because I think it's better that I answer your questions than that I try to sort of cover what I think you've missed.
As you can see, this is a big subject, so we could talk for days if you let us go. Yeah. So tell us where to stay. And remember, I'm a noob, right? I am nowhere near as advanced in this. So, and I can already get off on tangents, obviously, so.
Siobhan writes, question, how many words should someone start with? There are two answers to that, I would say. Either you start with 10 to 30 words. You just write them down and you say them out loud, and you kind of taste what they feel. That is how I do it. When I try to find what I need my language sound like and look like, that's what I do. I just write down a bunch of words. I don't have any grammar. I don't have any phonology. I don't have anything. No phonetics. Nothing. I just write them down and then I say them and see. Okay, we're gonna change that. We're gonna change this, etc., etc. Or the other answer is none. You do not start with words because that's way later. You start with the sounds. So either or. Just make up a bunch of words that sound the way you want, or you go straight into phonetics and just pick out the sounds that you want. I would say the second one is the more correct version, but the first one is probably the more apt one for world building.
I tend to do more like the first myself. I think about, okay, this is an important concept. It needs a word because the character is going to hear this word a lot. So what's the word? You know, come up with some sound that I like.
I use that method almost exclusively, and often the words that I come up with when I just splurge on a page, basically, end up becoming a core of the grammar and of the phonetics and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Once you have a few of those words, you'll have an idea of which sounds are being used in your language. And you'll also have an idea of kind of what's important to them. So you can develop those concepts from there, right? Even in, you know, vulgar lang, right? You take those words, you put them into your vocabulary, right? And there's a slot for that, right? And you spell it out in IPA. Then what I do from there is I'll take all the sounds that were used in those IPA and I'll put them in the option for either, you know, the consonants or the vowels or the diphthongs, depending on what they're appropriate to, right? And then maybe I'll add a couple more, maybe I won't, and then I'll have it generate the rest of the vocabulary, basically, right? So, and then if I need more words, I'll make them up later. So that's what I start with for sure.
I think the two most important parts, if you're actually conlanging and not just winging it to get something to use, because that's also conlanging. But if you're trying to make a cohesive system, I would say the phonetics, what sounds do you have, and phonology, how do they affect each other, and then of course phonotactics, how do these sounds work together? And that is my least favorite part of conlanging, but it's incredibly important because you picked out all of these sounds. How do these sounds work together? Can you say kt? Can you have a K and a T next to each other? Can you have an N and an ng next to each other? Can you have a Q and a P together? You have to start to figure out where are these sounds going to appear. And I learned a method for phonotactics that are you have the what's the word? The coda, the nucleus, and the I don't remember the first word, but it's the start of a syllable, the center of a syllable, and the end of a syllable. Where can the sounds appear, and where can they appear next to other sounds? That is a super useful thing to get the structure and feel for your language. Onset, thank you. I just blanked on the word. Onset, nucleus, and coda. It's the start, the middle, and the end of a consonant, or of a syllable. And which sounds can appear where and next to which sounds. That's a really useful thing to define early on when you're conlanging. So pick your sounds and where can these sounds appear. Once you've done that, you've got the structure of the language done already. So just sit there and generate a lot of words and see, do they make sense? Is there something here that appears that this, you can't really say this, or that doesn't look right? Then you can change your rules for the phonotactics until the language looks and feels the way you want. Then you can just make up infinite amounts of words and grammar, and you're well on your way to make a language. But those two are the most important.
I found that to be a real headache myself, right?
It is a super headache, and I hate it.
Yeah.
But it is so important.
Yes.
It just takes a long time.
Right. Okay. Say you're, using vulgarlang to expand on what you've done, right? And with your initial vocabulary, right? There is a section for forbidden combinations, right? Which will save your ass in this department. But expect to run your language through 2 or 3 times of generation before you figure out, at least before you realize, oh fuck, I forgot that no, that combination doesn't work. You can't say that. Yeah, right. It's kind of a nightmare. So
yeah, I think I crashed Con Workshop several times trying to generate syllables because I had 2 broad rules. So it generated billions of syllables, and I was like, I forgot. I should limit myself slightly more. Ooh, that's an interesting question.
That is a very good question. Lorraine asks, for the 2 of you, what sounds do you prefer not to use in your conlanging?
You want to begin, or shall I?
No, go ahead. Actually, I have to think about this a bit.
I try to avoid sounds that I have difficulty making myself, which for me are a lot of the uvular sounds. I can make a r, okay. I'm not French, but I can make a decent uvular trill. I can, however, not make uvular stops, so I avoid them. Like Arabic has a lot of those sounds, and I'm terrible at making them, so I don't use them. I avoid bilabial trills, because it sounds ridiculous. I think, although it exists in a couple of human languages, I just don't like the sound. It sounds silly to me, so I avoid them. I tend to avoid strong plosives, and I think they're called implosives, where you inhale while making the sounds. They're a feature in Thai, for instance, Thailand. They have the key phrase is big box, and it's big box where the consonants go backwards down your throat. It's really weird and really hard to pronounce, so I avoid those. Yeah, there's probably a lot of sounds that I avoid, but mostly because I have trouble pronouncing them myself. I can practice, of course. I mean, I learned how to make the Welsh sound and sounds. I've learned a lot of sounds by conlanging, but some of them are just uncomfortable to me. I can't make them fast enough. And at that point, I start to realize that the people who are going to read this are probably not going to be able to do it. So why include it? That's how I do it.
Right. Okay, having given it some thought, I think that in my case, it's sounds that I was either mocked or discouraged from making as a child. Right? I don't actually have any strong feelings towards the different sounds, and I'm willing to put sounds in that I have difficulty pronouncing because I can envision it even if I can't say it. Right? I like languages and I'm interested in that, and I figure I'll teach myself. I'll frickin' learn, damn it. Right? But when you're a baby, you make all these different sounds, right? All the sounds that exist in the IPA. Right? And some of them you were encouraged to make, and some of them you were strongly discouraged from making. So if it is a sound I was strongly discouraged from making, I don't like it. There's a lot of palatial type vowels, for example, and it's when we say them, a lot of Asian languages have these, South Asian and whatnot, right? And when we say them in like to native English speakers, it tends to have a cadence like we're mocking people. Right? And, people who have speech difficulties or whatever in English who may have difficulty making the rounded sound that we, depending on where we are, like to make, right? So I don't like those palatial vowels. I don't think there's anything wrong with them. I just don't like the sounds of them myself because I was taught not to like them. I was taught that was mocking someone if you made noises like that, so you don't make those noises, right? Another thing is I don't like to combine sibilants. Right? And the reason why is because I have a bit of a speech impediment. I have a lisp. I've always had it, and I find it very difficult. to make those noises together. The word sixth is my fucking bane, right?
Yeah, an eighth.
No, eighth is okay, but there's like 3 of those motherfuckers in sixth. And guess what day of the month my birthday is on? You know?
Of course.
Of course it is. Yes. Yeah, so I find that a bit of a nightmare, and I avoid those. Words that have multiple sibilants, and yeah. So, sibilants being SE type sounds, right? Plosives being, you know, B's and P's, that kind of thing. So.
Another key element of conlanging that you should be aware of is that most sound that you can make come in a voiced and an unvoiced version. So you have S, which is a sibilant, and then you have Z, which is also a sibilant, but it's voiced. You have F, which is F, and then you have a V. Those are the same sound. They're just voiced.
Yes.
Unvoiced. And that's something that it took a while for me to click for some reason when I started conlanging. But once it clicked, it makes sense. We have unvoiced and voiced sounds. That's a really basic thing. And the interesting part is that most languages don't include both versions of the same sound. So you can have a language that has the unvoiced version of a sound, but not a voiced version, which is interesting.
Yes. I actually like the voiced or the unvoiced plosive, I guess, or sibilant rather, Z sounds. I like those. Maybe because I didn't have any trouble making them. But yeah.
No, it's because you Americans you turn all S's into Z.
It's true. It's true. We really do. You know, surprise, you know? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
There was a question up here. Walking Dead Lover and Kajitan asked if a language is a dead language or it's written only, do you really need to worry about the sounds? Again,
yeah, good
I would
question.
argue that this is world builder's disease, right? As a conlanger, I would say yes, because you need to understand what each symbol represents in sound so that you can write it. But at the same time, is that overkill if you're just going to have a couple of texts here and there? Yeah, probably. So I would say if you're conlanging, yes, you do. But if you're world building, no, you don't. That's my answer.
Right. I won the Secret Cipher prompt category for summer camp this year with semaphore was my language that I used, right? And I basically just took semaphore as it exists and said that my elves made it up instead of, you know, the French, actually, initially invented semaphore, right? And, you know, I basically, okay, and I didn't put any attention at all to the sounds because it's irrelevant, right? It's a language of pictures representing letters, right? And those letters will probably change when I more fully develop my Elvish, because I will think about how that had an effect on things, but it doesn't bloody have to. You get the idea. It's a flag code or a signal code that means things you can spell out so you can communicate messages quickly over distances when you cannot hear what the message is, right? That's the goal. So who cares, right? Who cares what it sounds like, right?
Exactly. At that point, you don't need to.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. There's another question up here, too, that I missed initially. Author Goddess says, is there an aspect of culture that does not affect language? What do you pick to use? That's a big one.
Can't think of one off the top of my head.
I agree. I don't think a culture... Okay, humans create things when they have to. And not a moment before. So
we're lazy.
We are lazy, but we can be really inventive when we need to be, right? So if it doesn't exist in their culture, they probably don't have a word for it. Check out, talk to Coffee sometime, Coffee Quills, about what the literal meaning of certain Japanese words are for different things, like psychiatrist. It's fascinating. Right? They're
those are interesting. East Asian languages in general are pretty fascinating. They hurt my head, but they're interesting. Yes.
My poor, my poor trained brain that's been trained in a certain way really has, I have real trouble. I'm trying, but it's hard. They're complex for me, right? So
Yeah.
Conversely, also language affects culture, right? There's a whole
Because it affects
theory.
how we think.
Yeah. There's a whole theory, which name I have forgotten at the moment. I bet you will know, right, Toblin? But it's the idea that it shapes your comprehension, right? The language that you learn changes how you think and the ways in which you think and affects what you can think of, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's a whole, like, and it's got a name, right?
Yeah, I can't remember it off the top of my head either, but I know what you're talking about, and yes, that is correct. Your language can limit your cognitive abilities and your imagination, because you can't put to words and then you can't put to concept what you're trying to think about. It's very fascinating, actually.
It's really okay. Like, the most obvious example I can think of is, I have been told, I do not speak Japanese, right? But I have been told that the word for blue and green are the same, right?
In Russian as well.
Right. So people who come from a culture where the word blue and green are the same actually have difficulties distinguishing between certain shades of blue and green. They can see the same shades, everybody sees the same shades, right? But they can't tell you why this is a different color from that one, right? And I think there's another language that uses gradations of red, right? That are like red and pink, and there's another thing that are completely, they're all different words for variations of the color. They're much better at differentiating the difference between those shades of pink than, say, I would be, right? Because I don't have more than one word for that in my language, right? So it's really interesting. What was the triggering word?
Colors in general are so fluid that where you separate them is very arbitrary. So it makes sense that different languages have different separations of colors.
Right. Sorry. I'm not sure here. Just a second. I'm going back. My automod did something, and I don't really understand why it did it. Okay, automod's stupid. I'll just say that right now.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't surprise me.
It says, Siobhan used add permitted term, chicken, goose, 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 he, meme. What? Oh, maybe it's the name of a meme that's offensive. That must be it, that it triggered somehow.
Okay.
Whatever the hell that is.
Yeah, my automod has been murdering a couple of sentences as well. Where you go, just, what? Why?
Yeah, it just confuses. Either I'm too old to understand the reference, or I don't know what, right? It seems to not like any LGBTQIA defining term, I have noticed. It will...
Yeah.
All of that. It'll filter it all out.
RPG Dinosaur Bob, if I'm not mistaken, that is a myth. A fairly stereotypical myth, too, that the Inuit have like 50 plus words for ice and snow.
Right.
I don't think that's actually true. I think that's a myth.
I think it has been, yeah, I think it is a myth. I've read that it is, right?
Yeah, and especially since their language is obnoxiously complex. I actually did some studying of northern people, not just all of them, all around the world. And they're fantastic, but they are the worst case of agglutinative fusional languages. And those were a lot of words. But what it means is that they glue a lot of concepts together. And fusional means that they shape and affect each other. So basically, you can say an entire sentence in one word, because all the things that they tack on at the end and the beginning and the middle of the word carry different meanings, and they affect each other. So it's not just like Finnish generally. I don't speak Finnish, but Finnish generally, they don't change a lot when they keep adding suffixes. They do change, but not a lot. The Inuit languages, that escapes me at the moment, the word or the name for the language. But anyway, they every one of them affect each other, and they can affect the entire word, which means that one word can be it's just so much information in one word. It's fascinating, and I recommend not making a conlang that is like that, because you're going to hate yourself. It's so complex.
Yeah. It sounds like a nightmare.
Usually vowel modulation in Finnish, exactly. And the Inuit languages are even worse. They're so complex. Really cool. Absolutely. For a linguist nerd like me, it's super fascinating. But it hurts my soul trying to learn how it works.
Yeah, I feel you. I do. Yeah. I haven't even tried yet. I'm having enough trouble here. You know. Yeah, Lorraine says, Sable, is your birthday September 6th? No.
No.
There was another question I'm trying to go back here and grab. Yeah, Lorraine made another good comment here. She says, speaking of the voiced or not voiced, right? She says it's usually an exhale, but English doesn't have a lot of variance between inhale, exhale. Yeah, that's true, right? I am generally as understandable speaking or while yawning or just speaking. Right, exactly. We have what we call yawnies, right? And it means the same thing. But if you did that in other languages, it would mean a totally different thing, right? What I think is really interesting is tonal languages.
Mm-hmm.
That is why things go up and down in Chinese, right? Where it's like, right? That actually has different meanings.
It has, yes. And they have several different tones. And honestly, I always found the concept of tonal languages to be really, really confusing. And it's like, why would you do that? It's super complex, and it can't possibly add anything to the language, and why? And then I realized my own language is tonal. I hadn't thought about it, but Swedish is a tonal language.
Is it?
Not
I didn't
to
know
the
that.
extent of Chinese, but it is a tonal language. You can absolutely change the entire meaning of a sentence by changing the tone. And that's just something you do subconsciously, inherently. You don't need to think about it. It just happens. And that was an interesting realization. I had to look at how to speak Swedish for Americans, like a course to realize this, because we do it so inherently that we don't even think about our language being tonal.
Huh. That's interesting, actually. We do some of that in English too, obviously, right? If you bring up the tone at the end, it's a question.
Yeah,
if you bring it down, it's a statement.
Intonation is pretty common in Western languages.
Except for if you are a millennial or younger girl, apparently. Millennial or younger woman. Because I guess there's always the going up. Because maybe we're afraid people might actually take it as a definitive statement. And if they do that, then we might not have permission to speak, I guess, is the impression that it gives me as an older woman, I have to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, that's often how it's done, right? So why this became something for women but not men, I don't know.
Yeah, and then there's dialects of English that always do it, like some Aussie dialects or accents.
That's true.
What do you call them? Have question intonation, and certain British ones also have question intonation, or high rising terminal, I think is the proper word for it. But
that's a good point.
It's to me, my language does not have it. We only have it on questions. So to me, it sounds weird.
Right. Yeah. Barbarossa asked a while back, have you heard of the Turkish bird language? And if so, do you understand how it works? I can't wrap my head around the idea of a language fully defined by whistles and frequencies. I believe Kayatan put a link to that somewhere in the chat. So I don't know anything about it at all.
I have a really, really simple explanation for how it works. Have you heard of Morse code?
There you go.
That is essentially a whistling language where you have long and short tones. But with whistling, you also have frequencies. So you can vary more. You can have long and short, and you can vary the frequency. You can do staccato and stuff. So yes, the whistling language is cool. I like it. It's very, very long ago I read about it or watched anything related to it. I just remember seeing a video about it when I was like 25 something. So it's a long time ago. but it fascinated me, and it was part of what got me into conlanging, because it just blew my mind that you could communicate by whistling.
I think that's fascinating too. Yeah, that's a neat idea. Cool.
I was actually thinking about Valley Girl, Lorraine, when we talked about high rising terminal. Isn't that a part of the Valley Girl cadence of speaking?
Yes.
That you have a high rising terminal.
Yes, it is. And to be fair, it was a fad for all of us in the 80s to talk like that for a while.
I see.
Maybe our kids picked it up. But I really don't like it, because for me, the fact that women picked it up and men did not is what bothers me about it. It implies that we're asking for permission to speak and give our opinion. And I even find myself doing it on occasion, and I strongly dislike that. So I will tell you what I want when I want.
It's so fascinating how much we do subconsciously.
Yeah, legit. Okay, Author Goddess had another question. Do you think there is something missing in languages that we have gone or that we have gone... okay, wait a minute. I'm not sure I understand. Do you think there is something missing in languages that we have gone so meme-heavy in communication? Are you meaning that... Do you think it's because something is missing that we have gone meme-heavy in communication? Or are you asking... do you think that if a language has gone meme-heavy in communication, that it is missing something? Because that could be read either way.
Memes fill a very effective function in language. If you think about when emojis first showed up in communication, you could suddenly, without writing anything, you could convey a feeling or an action with just a single symbol. Memes are just that taken to the next level. You can convey an entire concept with a GIF or a meme. It is an incredibly information-dense way of communicating. Granted, most of it is crap, but it's still very information-heavy and it's ineffective because you have to also be in on it to understand it. If you send me a meme that I don't know the context of, it is entirely pointless. It has no function. It transmits no information. But if you're in on it, it is an effective way to communicate. I mean,
yeah.
If you just look at Twitter, how many people communicate with GIFs, for instance? Would you just reply with a GIF? Now, I know GIFs aren't necessarily memes, but it's an effective way to communicate. So I think it's not that the language is missing something. I think it's just an evolution of language. We're making information more dense.
I personally think,
and it's also kind of it's a generalization because we humans like to do that. So even if a meme doesn't mean exactly what we mean, you get the general gist of it.
Yeah. I think it largely comes from the shift from voice to text in communication. Yeah. Because we started talking in text because they charged us for voice but not for text. It's totally... I totally blame that, by the way. So consider that, right? That's a chaos system, right? A little change, some small thing at the beginning of something makes huge consequences in its evolution, right? So because cell phone companies were charging for voice but not text, everybody started talking in text. Hence the evolution of social media as we understand it, and everybody talks in text. But text loses a lot of nuance. It doesn't have a lot of emotional stuff. How many flame wars did I used to get into on Yahoo groups, man? Right? Because we were still figuring all that shit out, right? Hence, they invented emojis and then memes, right? Yeah. And the idea being to communicate emotional nuance. So, does it lose something? Yes, because it's losing the ability to interact in a more face-to-face conversation to some degree, because the memes are now... Have you noticed that you have trouble communicating with your parents or grandparents? Have you noticed that? Right? And you make fun of them for it, don't you? Right? You're like, oh, they don't understand the meme. Ha ha, aren't they square? Right? But you're losing your ability to communicate with them of course they don't understand the meme. They're not from a culture that's on text 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? You might want to try learning how to communicate with them before those abilities are lost. Likewise, they could be making efforts in your direction too, right?
Yeah.
So, but it gains something, right? It loses something and it gains something. And I think that, I mean, like, and when I tell people I'm going to yeet something, you all get what I mean. You're on Twitch. You understand yeet. You know what that means. My mother would have to have it explained, right? But yeet's a good concept.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, and that's how any language evolves. You gain something, you lose something. Yeah. Yes. Yes, exactly. Kayatan says, examples of problems with written only is my name, right? You were pronouncing it wrong. Yes, I was pronouncing it Kajatan, and I noticed that a lot of people still do, right? And I had problems of conveying the current pronunciation through writing. Yeah, but that is, as Tomlin says, what IPA is for. That solves that problem.
Because IPA is phonetic. It's spelled literally how it's pronounced. And there are more languages who are like that. Korean, for instance, is a phonetic language. The letter is always pronounced the same way, no matter where it is, or which other letters it's next to. They are always pronounced the same way. Which English is not.
No, English is pronounced in vastly different ways depending on where you are in the world.
English is fuck pronunciation.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll just make it up wherever we are, however we feel like it, pretty much.
Yeah, and as long as you're close, people understand what you mean anyway.
What does yeet mean?
Yes, it is.
See, this is awesome, right? People are illustrating the difficulty of memes, as you've pointed out, Toblin, right? A meme is useless when you do not have the context to understand what it means, right? Because some people are like, what does yeet mean? Other people are like, I literally just learned that a week ago, right? I didn't know that until I met Chrysalia. Yes. Yes. Right? So, for those who may not know, who are listening to this, to yeet something means to throw it, usually with emotional, passionate attachment, as far away from you as possible.
Yeah, it usually doesn't mean that you aim at anything specific. Because if you aim at something specific, it's not yeet, it's Kobe.
Right. Exactly. Right. But yeet is like, get that away from me, yeet! Yeah. So.
And that's actually an interesting thing when we're talking pronunciation. But though I don't think it relates to Conlang specific, but the goatee fish, that's more or less a meme in and of itself. How English can be, you can write fish in English by writing GHOTI. Because you have rough, which is GH at the end, which is pronounced F. So you have GH, F. And then you have women, which is an O that is pronounced like an I. So you have fe. And then TI in situation. And you're suddenly a fish. But you spell it goatee. But the thing is, it's more complex than that. Because English has pronunciation rules that makes goatee be pronounced goatee, because you'll never start a sentence with a GH that sounds like an F. So English does have more pronunciation rules than you think. It's a funny meme, but it's not actually correct. You learned something today.
There you go. Right. Lots of people are saying things like the problem with IPA is that most keyboards don't have a way to write it. Yes, it does. Go to your character map. Right? That character map function has CTRL and some numbers, and that will, all the IPA symbols exist in that.
Yeah, and if you're on like Mac or Linux, you can use the Unicode codes to write them.
Yeah, Unicode also works, right?
But I tend to actually just use the IPA chart and copy paste.
Me too.
Because it's faster.
Yep, totally. That's what I do, right? Emily has
it wouldn't be useful for actually communicating. You couldn't write in IPA because it would be super slow. But if you're just going to explain to someone how something is pronounced, it's a useful tool. But you wouldn't communicate with IPA. Right. Then you would need an IPA keyboard, obviously. our keyboards are not made for IPA.
Right. Yeah. Emily also points out, but how many people know how to pronounce IPA? You're right. I think more people should learn.
Yeah.
I think this would be very helpful, and I would recommend that in an increasingly multicultural and interactive world, this might be a good tool that people could use to help bridge communication gaps.
Definitely, yeah. And it's super useful when you're trying to learn languages. I mean, you can... There are so many ways to try and explain how something sounds by using... I've seen English or American people especially do these 3-letter with dashes between them, writing up how it would be pronounced, but those are subject to dialects.
Yes.
So even if you write them out, it wouldn't make sense to someone of a different dialect, because how do you know you're getting the correct vowel sound? So IPA is so much more useful.
Let's consider... Okay, I was trying to come up with an example. I've got one. Okay, English phrase. All right.
Yeah.
I'm all right. Okay, so that's what it sounds like to me. I'm all right. And you notice that when I'm saying it, I barely pronounce that L, right? That's West Coast Canadian accent. I'm all right. Okay?
All right, yeah.
Okay, so already we've got dialect. Okay? If you're in Kentucky...
And your okay is just K.
Right.
It's just the letter K.
Yeah, if you're in Kentucky, it's more like, all right, you know, or Texas, all right. You know, that's different. What if you're in Australia? All right. You know, those are all totally different sounds.
Yeah. And let's take an extreme example. House.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah. House. I mean, that's a relatively American pronunciation, but let's now do Irish. House.
Yeah. You're like, what?
That's entirely different.
By the way, the Bostonian accent sounds a bit like that, too. What?
Oh, it does?
Yeah, it does.
That's interesting.
Well, a lot of Irish people settled Boston. So.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. Right. Garage. Yeah. And that's not even, like, you know, just shifting slight vowels.
Interesting, because in Swedish, that last G has a ch sound to it.
Interesting.
So it's not a sh. So we say garage.
Wow, that's fascinating. See, there you go. This is the problem of dialect. And this is why we need to have...
and this is why you need IPA.
That's right. Yeah, coffee, which I pronounce coffee, right? Or coffee, or coffee.
And then you have coffee. I think that's...
That too, yeah.
Northeast, coffee.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. Hands Toblin a tissue to clear throat, says.
I have this problem actually when I try to explain our very Nordic letters. The A with a ring, the A with 2 dots, and the O with 2 dots.
Yeah.
Because those sounds really don't exist in English specifically.
What do they sound like? I am curious.
If we take the A with a ring over it, that's an O. It's a very deep O-like sound, like border, order, or.
Oh. Except it's more up in the mouth, I hear, right? So
it's pretty back and up. So border, or.
Okay.
And then you have the A with 2 dots, which can also be written as an ash, which is an AE letter. I don't know how many of you have seen that. I'm gonna drop it in chat. That's an ash. It's called ash, and it's pretty close. Ash.
That's interesting that's the A sound, because that's how most people would say that's the short A sound in English. You know, apple.
I mean, it depends on where it is in the language, because if you just say the letter straight up in Swedish, it's ä, not a. But you know, that's just language for you.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the O with the ring on it, or the O with the dots on it, that's ö. And I don't think that exists in English anywhere. It's the closest you can get to is like Arnold Schwarzenegger saying bird.
Huh. We would probably use the symbol that is the upside down E letter to represent that, because it would be sort of a de-emphasized U in our language, right?
Yeah,
Like
kind
we do have that sound, but we just think of it as a de-emphasized U, right? So
yeah. It's a rounded way back in the throat too. Bird. It's kind of like bird, but it's more open. Funny part is that's an attention sound in Swedish. It's like if you need someone's attention, you just go
I'll remember that.
It's kind of rude, so only do it to friends.
Right. That's like, hey.
Yeah. It's kind of like,
hey.
Yo, dude.
Yeah. Got it. Interesting.
Anyway, we got sidetracked again, but here's the thing, that there are so many different kinds of sounds that you, especially if you're English, you tend to think in letters, not sounds. Yes. Because you see a word in front of you, and it's like, that's an A. I know how the A is pronounced, but then it's not pronounced like that when it's another sound. But you don't think when it's another word, but you don't think about it.
Yeah.
Starting to really learn and explore IPA is a very interesting way of learning about language in and of itself, how we speak and how sounds change. Because just because it's spelled one way, it doesn't mean it's pronounced the same way. And not just by dialect. In a single dialect, you can have the same letter having multiple pronunciations depending on which word it is.
Yes. Oh, which reminds me, the great vowel shift. This is something that you will encounter when you're reading about languages that we should probably talk about. What is the great vowel shift?
You know, I don't know enough about it that I can speak with confidence and authority on it. But what it is basically a very, very, very rapid shift in the English language where multiple vowel sounds in language shifted a lot, which is why the spelling is so weird.
Yes.
I can remember a very specific example. Yeah, house, for instance.
Right.
House is spelled O-U, but it's not an O-U sound because the O is O in actual IPA, and the U sound is an U, a very deep sound. And that's because before the vowel shift, house was pronounced hus.
Yep.
And that's very close to how we pronounce it in Sweden. We say hus. It's just slightly lower back in the throat. Hus.
Right.
So English, both American and British English and the other Englishes, still spell the way you did before the vowel shift, but the pronunciation has changed. And there's a lot of that has changed. But house was the one I could think about now. The house, the whose to house. And that's why English is so hard to spell.
And it's getting worse.
Because it doesn't make sense phonetically, because you kept the spelling, but the sounds changed, which means that nothing makes sense anymore. So you basically have to learn how each word is pronounced in order to speak proper English. Because you can't just look at it and know how it's pronounced, because everyone else from the rest of the world who knows sounds just go, what? Excuse me? How does a single letter I become a diphthong? It's E.
Yeah, exactly. It confuses the shit out of people, and it's getting worse, right? There is a theory that there is currently another great vowel shift going on in English, right? Like we're in it, right? Especially in
weird
places.
No one really knows what triggers it or why it happens. It just happens.
Yeah, exactly. And there are vast regional differences between English dialects in North America that I was not conscious of until I started learning about how languages work. I could come up with a million examples, but I don't think I'm going to. It's that I hear how, say, someone from, I don't know, Connecticut, right? I hear how someone from Connecticut pronounces certain things, and my brain translates them as the same language I'm speaking. But his vowel sounds are vastly different from my vowel sounds.
Yeah.
I just don't think of it because I'm used to looking at that letter A, right? And it meaning 7 or 8 different vowel sounds, right? And there's the short sound and the long sound, right? And that's how I'm taught to think about it. So that comes back to comprehension, right? Being based on language. But they're totally different how he pronounces an A.
Yeah, and you actually have some interesting consonant changes too, which is less common. Vowels are usually the things that change the most with dialects. But you also have, for instance, Texans and some Southern accents or Southern dialects in American actually have retroflexed consonants like D. It's not D. So you don't make the D front in the alveolar ridge right behind your teeth. You make it curled back a bit. It's not actually retroflex, but it's close. So it's a D. And that's the same as India and southeastern Asia makes those sounds. Both the T and the D is slightly retroflex in Texan and Southern accents, which is really interesting because that's something that generally doesn't exist in the West otherwise. But there it exists. So America is very rich when it comes to sounds. And in spite of that, it's all one language.
Yeah, legit. A good example there, right? Texans speaking of, as I would say, washing the car in the creek, right? As they would say it, washing the car in the creek.
Yeah.
Right?
Ka.
Yeah, me yelling at people in Texas says, Author Goddess, there is no R in wash!
And as on a similar note, you have the British English that tend to tie together words that end and start in vowels.
Yes.
So you have, wow, I have to come up with an example. I'm blanking out. But they tend to tie together. If your word ends in a vowel and the next word starts with a vowel, they tie it together with an R sound, which is interesting. Americans don't do that.
Right. I'm trying to think of an example, too. Wish Stretch
Yeah,
was
me
here.
too.
He can help us out.
Help me.
Yeah, Hef, you still in the chat? Help us out. Yeah, we do that in French, says Emily. Actually, yes, they do that in French, and it's a formal rule. They at least formalized it. We do that in dialects of English, didn't bother to fucking tell anybody. You know?
Interesting.
You just have to figure it out. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. I didn't know the French did that.
Yeah.
But that's interesting. Yeah, so as you can see and hear from all of this nerding about our languages, is that languages are super complex. It's about one of the most complex things we do as humans. And it's really difficult to imitate someone else. Just to imitate an accent or a dialect is really difficult. So I don't want to discourage you from conlanging in any way, because it is a lot of fun, but you have to you have to understand and establish early on why you're doing it, because otherwise you're easily going to feel like, okay, all the cool people are doing conlangs for their worlds, I need to do that too, and then you get completely lost because there's so much to conlanging. I mean, linguistics is an entire science in and of itself, and your conlanging is just applied science in that case. So what I'm trying to say is conlanging can be a useful tool, but you need to know how to use it. Unless you're doing it as a hobby, which I did for several years. I have probably 10, 12, 15 languages behind me that I have made that are in different states of completion and word lists, etc., etc. I mean, you can do it just for fun. There's nothing wrong in that. But if you're using it as a world building tool, you need to know why you're using it and what it's going to fulfill for you, because otherwise you're just going to crash. Conlanging isn't necessary for world building. It can help, but it's not necessary.
Absolutely. We're at 2:00 my time. How are you doing for your time?
I'm at 11 p.m. and I should probably go eat and sleep soon.
I figured we were getting pretty close to your end time.
Yeah.
We'll take 1 or 2 more questions, and then we will call it a day, I think. If there are any that are not going to send us off into nerd tangents.
Yeah, if there's a question that's going to take 3 hours to explain, I'm going to politely pass on that one.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, this is why all my language slots have been filled with variations of English, says Author Goddess. Yeah, I
Yeah.
hear you.
And I'm going
Yeah.
to say
They don't have to
that
be,
is
but they can be really
perfectly
complicated.
valid, because if you're writing a story, it is usually enough to tell the reader or the players that a person is speaking another language, rather than actually making another language for them to speak. It is
Yep.
usually enough. And you don't have to have an entire language. It's cool when you do. I mean, in one case, I had one of my players that I knew was really, really into this with language and decoding and stuff. I had a journal written in another language, one of my conlangs. He doesn't speak that language. He doesn't read that language. So I gave him a sort of cipher. I gave him a word list. I gave him some basic grammar functions, and then he had to translate it while the rest of the party was doing something else.
Right.
So and it was just happy coincidence, but he managed to translate the parts that were important to what the others were doing. So he could just go like, oh, no, don't do that. But it was very interesting. And that worked with him because I knew what kind of player he was. It would never have worked with one of my other players, for instance, because they didn't have the attention span, they don't like languages, and it wouldn't work. So you have to kind of figure out, well, who are you doing this for? And is it going to help them, or is it going to emphasize the story or enhance the story in any way, or am I just wasting my time? Because conlanging can absolutely be a waste of time. I don't think it is, but it can be.
Most of my players in a role-playing game like a couple of words in the other language so that they can use those words in common parlance and realize that this is a different culture. They like that feel, right? Some of them, Siobhan, for instance, will come up with entire phrases in the language if I let her get away with it, because she likes that kind of thing. She made up a quote for one of my religions, for example, that was in the original Orcish using the dictionary that I made. So that's fun. Right?
Yeah, it is fun. Absolutely. And conlanging can be an absolutely fantastic addition to your game or to your book. But again, you need to know which level to put it on, because I feel that most people look upon conlanging as this esoteric, weird wizard magic. It's not. It's actually very basic. You just need to have some patience to learn the basics before you can start doing it. And then it's relatively easy, to be honest. But again, that's when you can go off the board and do far too much. So
yeah, exactly.
You need to know where to put your efforts.
Couple
if
more
you just need a name for a village, you don't need an entire language. Like I did. I made languages that had basic grammar, phonotactics, and phonetics, so I have a coherent sound and look for the language. So you can instantly tell from which region of the world someone is, but that doesn't mean you can speak the language because it's not complete.
Right.
I don't need to make a complete language. Okay, I had to work a little bit extra for the Conlang article because I have to translate the damn thing.
Oh.
But for the game, you don't need more than that.
Okay. Yes, I see we missed a question. Our RPG Dinosaur Bob said a serious question, and this kind of relates to Barbarossa's questions from earlier. Barbarossa, just so you know, right, when we're done this part of the stream, I am going to put the stream down for a couple minutes, and then I'm going to go back up for at least a couple hours of my regular Sable's WorldForge. So you will have an opportunity to ask your question. So, you know, hang on, but it doesn't have to do with conlanging, right? He had an involved question he wanted to ask about culture, right? Anyway, yeah, RPG Dinosaur Bob says, a serious question, if you were conlanging for a race of bird folk with large beaks, but no teeth or lips, what phonetics would you use? This does relate to Barbarossa's Harpy language question.
Yeah.
So.
With large beaks, you can get whistling sounds, because if you look at birds, they can absolutely whistle, a lot of them. So you can make whistling sounds, you can make clicking sounds, because you can snap the beaks together. And birds generally also have very articulate tongues. So they can make smacking sounds and probably a lot of,
what do you call them? Now I'm starting to get tired here, I feel. But sounds like L, approximants. You can probably make with that. What you can't make are plosives, stops, for instance. You can't make B and P. You can probably not make nasals like M and N or ng, unless they also have a nose and they have the ability to close off the nasal or the airflow and push it through the nose like we do when you say M, N, ng. So whistles, clicks, approximants, uvular sounds. If they have a similar vocal tract as we do, then you could probably make all the k, g, and ch sounds that we make, because those are made down here, not with the lips. But all the labial sounds would probably be gone.
Yeah, basically, see if you need your lips to make it.
Alveolar ridge, so the T, TD sounds would also go away. So all the alveolar sounds would be gone.
Yeah. On the other hand, you might get some really good, whistles and clicks that you don't normally get in English. So.
Yeah. I mean, I heard a raven say hello very clearly as a human made it. And I mean, we have parrots. So birds have a wide range of articulations. But again, the alveolar sounds, nasals, stops, probably gone.
Right. Awesome. Okay. Any more questions, gang? If not, then I'll go back up here where I had Toblin's social links from the last time that he was on. So I will post them in the chat so that you guys can check out his stuff and keep in touch with him. Because, of course, he has all kinds of amazing stuff to talk about, not just conlanging, which is awesome. And you know what? We might have to do this. I said this last time you were on, too, but we might have to do this again sometime to get into deeper nerd detail. Maybe we should make like a community challenge or something.
There is so much to dive into world building, and the more I talk about it, the more I realize it's so much down to individual preference too. I mean, there are things that you shouldn't do and things that you probably should do, but it's a big span, and in between there is just like whatever. It's up to you. There's a lot to talk about.
I personally have only one piece of advice for. I'm like I said, defer to him. He is the conlanging guy. I am the nerd that is like just newbie in learning, right? But the only thing we haven't said yet is whatever you choose to do, make it consistent, right?
Yeah.
Don't change your rules halfway through, and if you do, right, have a reason for it. That's all. English does have a lot of contradictory rules, so yes, that exists in real life languages. But it makes them complicated. It makes people not want to learn this shit, right?
Yeah.
So for the purposes of a fictional language, make it relatively consistent would be my advice.
Yeah, because it's easier for you to work with, and you don't, unless you're trying to create a language that is going to be used in a movie to be convincing, like Na'vi for the Avatar movie, for instance, or Dothraki for Game of Thrones. Those languages have way higher standards than your language needs to. And also, a final word from me. Conlangers are one of the most elitistic bunch of assholes I have ever met. So, if you're going to learn conlanging, don't feel put down by people telling you how to do things. Listen to what they say and decide for yourself if you feel it's a good idea to do what they say or not. Because conlangers have some incredibly strong opinions on how to do things. Again, the whole vulgar lang versus con workshop is one of those. And it really doesn't matter as long as it works for you. What you should listen for is people who are trying to tell you or trying to teach you to avoid pitfalls and problems. Those you should listen to. But if someone tells you, now you should use this word, or you should make your language sound like a real language, and you should have, that's irrelevant for you as a beginner conlanger. You don't need to go that deep yet. So
have patience with us. We're an old curmudgeon-y people with a lot of opinions.
Yeah, did you notice him cringe when I mentioned Volgerlang? Did you see it? I saw it. It was fun. Yeah. But it worked for me. And he put a like on my language. I had very positive comments, so
yeah,
clearly
I liked
it
it.
worked for me.
But as I said, Volgerlang it's perfect for learning how to walk. But when you're already running the marathon, it's just going to slow you down.
It would be.
I don't like it.
It already had things that I ran into that I found very frustrating in terms of I wanted to do some things. But a Con Workshop has a very steep learning curve. I opened it up. I remember this. I looked at it and I went, Jesus Christ, and I closed it.
It's incredibly tough, and it doesn't even try to hide the syntax from you either. It just throws terms at you, and you just go, "What does that even mean?"
Right.
It just assumes that you know this. The other tool is Con Workshop.
Yeah, you're typing it. I'm typing it. There we go. You beat me. Yeah.
Yeah,
that's the one.
It is an incredibly powerful tool, but it is also incredibly obtuse, and it requires you to understand languages. So before you start making your language on Con Workshop, and you should really only do that if you're serious about conlanging, because if you just need a language that is going to work in a world or in a book, Volgerlang is better because it'll get you something that's good enough way faster than Con Workshop.
Yeah.
That's just a fact of life. I mean, it's the same with all tools. If you're going to make a map, Incarnate is great for making a map quickly. But if you want to make something that looks a little bit better, you probably go with something like WonderDraft. And then you realize that all the WonderDraft maps kind of look the same. So if I want to make a map that looks convincing and pretty, I need to use something like Photoshop, maybe. Yeah. So it's the right tool for the right amount of work and what you need it for. And don't go hardcore immediately. You have so much to learn, and you can't learn if you're busy being frustrated at the tools because you don't understand them. So Volgerlang is fine. And it's just not fine for me personally.
And guys,
I just want to make that clear.
Volgerlang might be too complicated for what you're trying to do. You may not need to go that far. It generates a 4,500 word dictionary. What the hell do you need that for if you're coming up with a few phrases in a dead language that nobody speaks anymore? Speaking of the, current challenge, right? A dead language is a language that is no longer commonly used by a broad population, loosely, right? Latin, even though it's still in use, is a dead language because it is generally only used liturgically or in scholarly forms, right? So you don't have to have a huge vocabulary, or it could be as lost as, I think I'm trying to remember an ancient language where we've got some words from a single, my brain. We've been talking too long. Sumerian? It's just not doing it. Pardon?
Sumerian, I think, is pretty much gone.
Okay, so Sumerian, we know some of it, but there's a lot of it we don't know because we've got fragments of shit, right? I think the language of the Hittites is the one I was thinking of, that we've got a few words from a couple of recovered, I think, vases, and that's it, right? So your dead language might just need a handful of things. It doesn't have to have a whole language, right?
Exactly. And more importantly, when we have that little, we don't even have context. We have words. We don't know how they're pronounced. We don't know what they mean. They're just words. And if that's the language you need, you absolutely don't need to conlang. You can just scribble down a couple of words and you're done. Yeah. Don't overdo it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much, Toblin, for being on the show today. I have had a great time.
I had fun too. We had a little bit of a trouble staying on topic, but that's because languages are interesting.
They're fun. They really are. I think they're lots of fun. I hope we've communicated that too. And I don't think it was too bad. I mean, we may have gone down a couple of rabbit holes, but it's the things that make it interesting that makes you want to do this in the first place, right? Do we know how ancient Egyptian
was pronounced? Yes, we do, actually.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, we do. I'm not going to go into it, but we do know.
Yeah. Lapping holes, says James. Yes, the house lapping holes. Well, you know where you are, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. No, that
Anyway,
was cool.
thank you for having me. It was fun.
Definitely a pleasure, as always. Right, and we'll see you again sometime. For everybody else, thank you for joining us. I'm going back up in a few minutes with some regular, usual Sable's WorldForge. I'll probably need about a 10-minute break. Right, so, just stay tuned if that's what you're here for. And if not, have a great rest of your day. And we'll see you in a few minutes. Thanks again, Toblin. Bye.